All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Thompson, counselor. I'm the chair of the Economic and Community Development Committee. The clerk has confirmed that we have quorum, so I'm calling meeting 27 of the Economic and Community Development Committee to order. I'd like to welcome everyone, and since this is our first meeting of 2022, I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year and welcome. Today's meeting is being held with members of council and city staff participating by video conference. The public continues to participate electronically and can watch the meeting streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. These measures are necessary to comply with public health guidelines and prevent the spread of COVID-19. I ask everyone for their patience with any delay and or technical issues which may come up during the course of the meeting. We currently have, I think it's probably about 4 or 5 speakers, and the clerk will confirm that for me a little bit later. The clerk staff have connected all registered speakers to the meeting by audio. The list of speakers can be viewed online by visiting the Economic and Community Development Committee page at toronto.ca/council and clicking the speakers box for today's meeting. Members, this is a paperless office. The clerk has provided all agenda material on toronto.ca and via the CMP, which is the clerk's portal, meeting portal. City Clerk's IT staff will be available to help members with their devices. Members, please keep your mic muted unless you wish to question staff or speak on an item, and ensure that your video is turned on. As part of each agenda item, I will ask members to raise their hand or unmute their mics if they wish to question staff or speak. I will then create a speakers list and we'll call on members when it is their turn to speak. When voting on an item or a motion, I ask that members ensure that they turn on their videos and raise hand to indicate their vote. Members, I want to remind you that you must submit and approve your motion by emails. Staff are available at ecdc@toronto.ca to help with motions. If there are any visiting members attending the meeting, I would encourage you to turn on your videos so that I know that you are present and will give you the opportunity to ask questions of staff or speak. This will also assist the clerk staff to record attendance for this meeting. And I know that there are a few visiting members here, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Ainsley, and Councillor McCalby is also here with us as well. Although we are in different locations today, the committee would like to acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. Members, are there any declaration of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Looking at the screen, I see none. Thank you very much. Next, we need a motion to confirm the minutes of our last meeting, which was held on December 1st, 2021. Okay, Councillor Lai is moving. I see Councillor Lai's hand. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. All right, thank you very much. Let's now proceed with a review of the agenda. We have 9 items on the agenda, and there is a new business item that I'd like to introduce, and it is titled 2022 Economic Outlook presentation from Douglas Porter, who is the Chief Economist and Managing Director of BMO Financial Group. All right, so let me just go through the agendas, members, and you will, and visiting members, if you'd like to hold something, please just let me know. All right, we are starting with EC 27.1, which is an overview of employment lands in the area south of Eastern Avenue. We're going to hold that item for presentation by staff. I believe Mr. Cantos is here. I'm not sure who else is here with him, but we're going to hold that item. Also, Councillor Fletcher has an interest in that item as well. Our next item is EC 27.2, Business Improvement Area BIA 2022 Operating Budget Report 1. What say you, members? Okay, Vice Chair Grimes, you're moving that item. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. Our next item is EC 27.3, changes to Business Improvement Area Board of Management. Looking to see Councillor Cressy, you moving that item? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. The next item is EC 27.4, Little Portugal, on Dundas Business Improvement Area, name change. What say you? Okay, see your hands. Councillor Cressy's moving it. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Our next item is EC 27.5, which is music rehearsal space in the City of Toronto. There is a speaker on that item, so I'm going to hold that one. All right. The next item is EC 27.6, 2SL GBTQ plus small business and cultural space. Just looking at the screen, someone wishing to move. Councillor Ainsley, did you want me to hold that item? Yes, okay, I'm going to hold that item. Councillor Ainsley wishes to hold that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just going to put it in your name here. Okay. And our next item is EC 27.7, a preliminary service plan for transgender and non-binary youth. What say you, members? Councillor Cressy, you moving that? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Councillor Ainsley.
Could I have a hold on that one as well, please?
Of course, yes. Okay.
Sorry about
Councillor
that.
Ainsley would like to hold? That's fine. Okay, I've just listed in your name here, Councillor Ainsley. That's fine. Thank you. All right. Our next item is EC 27.8, review of guidelines for the opening of the City of Toronto Emergency Cooling Center. I'm going to hold that one because we have speakers on that item. And next is EC 27.9, award of request for proposal document number 3003023400572 to multiple suppliers for the provision of short-term accommodations for shelter clients through the use of hotel, motel, and or approved equivalent operators. I'm going to hold that item. And then finally, the new business item, which is EC 2710. That's the presentation by Douglas Porter. So we've added that. All those in favor of adding that item to the agenda? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. Members, I'm going to
Mr.
ask
Chair.
that.
Sorry, it's
Yes,
Councillor
Councillor
Ainsley. Sorry, with the committee's indulgence, my apologies. I can let number 6 go. I got confused there for a moment. I didn't need to hold number 7. I can let number 6 go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine. So Councillor Ainsley no longer wishes to hold EC 27.6, and Councillor Vice Chair Grimes, you're moving that item. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry,
so
one
that
quick point of privilege, Councillor Thompson, sorry. With apologies, as you know, I did submit a letter to EC 27.9. I'm hopeful I'll be here for that item, but if I'm not, I'm just hopeful that, yes, you can give it every consideration and hopefully move to the agenda, but hopefully I'll be here for that item. Thank you.
Right. May I just ask you a question before you proceed, just in case you have to leave? You are moving a March date with respect to that item?
When staff can come back. If they can come back in March, that's ideal. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I'm flexible. So I'm flexible on when they report back to you. I think March is their intent, and I'm okay with that.
Fair enough. But you're aware then that this matter will not proceed. The matter will not be dealt with.
Right, they're going to report back before they sign off on it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Just as long as you're aware, because I thought there were some concerns with respect to wanted to fast track this. Just as long as that's fine. As long
No,
as you're
no,
aware.
no, no. Like I think we
Okay.
need to look at that's before they sign on.
I
I'm hopeful I'll
totally,
be here for the
I
item,
totally
but if
agree.
not, I think that's
Yeah.
okay.
I totally agree with you, but that's great. Thank you very much, Councillor. All right. So members, we are going to move now to a presentation by Douglas Porter. Douglas Porter has over 30 years of experience analyzing global economic and financial economies and financial markets. As chief economist at BMO Financial Group, he oversees the macro and financial market forecasts and co-authors the firm's weekly flagship publication, Focus. Mr. Porter manages the team that has won numerous awards, including Best Forecasters for Canada by Focus Economics, Top Canadian Forecaster by Bloomberg, and the prestigious Lawrence Klein Award for Forecast Accuracy of the US economy. As a respected commentator on economic and financial trends, he is regularly quoted in the national press and often interviewed on radio and television. Before joining BMO, Mr. Porter held positions of economics and economist and country risk analyst with other Canadian financial institutions and began his career at the Bank of Canada. Mr. Porter has been a member of C.D. Howe Monetary Policy Council since 2008 and serves on the investment management committees of the Bank of Montreal's Canada Pension Plan and Western's Endowment Fund. He also sits on the board of directors of the Toronto Financial International and on the American Bankers Association's Economic Advisory Committee. Mr. Porter has earned a CFA as well as earned a master's degree in economics from the University of Western Ontario. I'd like members and committee non-members to welcome Mr. Douglas Porter. Mr. Porter, good morning and welcome. Happy New Year. You have the floor, sir.
Good morning, and thank you very much, sir. So it's my distinct pleasure. Thank you for inviting me here today. Essentially, what I'm planning on doing is going over very briefly our forecast on where we see the global, the regional economies going over the next year in this very complex backdrop. And I have to say, this is arguably the most complicated economic backdrop that I have faced in my career, which does span back to the early 80s. And I would assert it's actually even more complex than what we were dealing with at the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. If we turn to the next slide, I would definitely say Omicron has thrown us yet another curveball. And by the way, these figures are on a per capita basis, so you can compare and contrast, first of all, prior waves and also versus the US, Canada, and Europe. And I think the key here is that it's affecting each region of the world almost simultaneously. At the very least, it is going to chill growth broadly in the first quarter of this year. At this point, we're expecting no growth in the Canadian economy in the first quarter of the year, I should say. We do think we'll see quite a sturdy rebound later this year, but at the very least, it has chilled things to begin 2022. If we turn to the next chart, please. Globally, we're still anticipating an above average year for the global economy this year. Just to put all these figures, facts and figures into perspective, if you look at the table at the bottom, a quote normal year for the global economy would be about 3% growth after inflation. And all these numbers are after inflation. So clearly we've seen anything remotely close to normal in recent years. Deep dive in 2020, a very solid comeback in 2021, but we have not completely gotten back to underlying trend. We think that growth won't be completely back to quote normal until about late 2023 or so. So, I think there's a few things to take away here is almost every major economy in the world, we still see with above average growth in 2022, but there's still work to be done before we get back to normal. I know that one specific question I had before this session was what's the outlook for China? We remain relatively constructive on China. They've had a lot of tailwinds, certainly, because of the very heavy demand globally for goods. for products, and as the biggest exporter in the world, they've benefited mightily from that. But between some cooling for the demand for goods, and also because of the issues among their property developers, we certainly see milder growth this year in China. It's going to stumble out of the gate in 2022, but we're still looking at relatively solid growth. You see somewhat above the global average through the remainder of this year. If we turn to the next chart, please. So that's looking at that's the 30,000 foot look. Let's bring it down to ground level. What do we see for North America? Well, to some extent, it's very similar to what we have for the global economy. Things are likely to be a little bit cooler from the rebound in 2021, but still above average growth in both Canada and the U.S. One thing I would point to is there's definitely been a distinction between Canada and the U.S. You can see that Canada fell a lot further during the early stages of the pandemic. We've largely recovered mostly in line with the US, but we have tended to lag, partly due to the fact that our restrictions have run longer and been deeper. You can see a few of the stutter steps in the Canadian economy over the past year, where we actually had an outright setback last spring. As I mentioned, we see a flattening in the first quarter of this year, but we do think that after the current restrictions do let up, that we will see a fairly solid recovery through the spring, and that overall, we think there's more catching up to do in the Canadian economy. We do suspect that Canada will largely match, if not slightly outpace, the U.S. and overall growth rates in both 22 and 23. And like I said, as for the global economy, we see somewhat above average growth both this year and next. If we turn to the next chart, please. I think one area where there has just been a spectacular recovery, and I have to say this has been a much faster improvement than I think any economist thought possible back in the dark days of the spring 2020, is just how much the job market has improved. Even though we've gotten here in very different circumstances, Canada and the U.S. have basically both seen their unemployment rates get all the way back down to almost to where they were before the pandemic began. We're not quite there yet. And we are likely to see a bit of a backing up in the jobless rate because of the current restrictions in January and February. But we suspect that by later this year and through 2023, we could be even looking at lower unemployment rates than we saw before the pandemic. And just as a reminder, those jobless rates that we were looking at just before the pandemic began were in some cases the lowest in decades. For instance, in the US, the jobless rate before the pandemic was actually the lowest we'd seen in 50 years. So these are, relatively speaking, very, very low unemployment rates that we're looking at present. You can see that in the bottom right-hand corner, Toronto's jobless rate is still well above pre-pandemic levels. Part of that is just due to the fact that Toronto has, faced a relatively more stringent restriction environment than some other provinces or even some other cities. Also, I would just caution that the regional numbers are on a 3-month moving average, so they're not quite as timely as, say, the national numbers would be. And I suspect that if we were to see the month-to-month move, it would actually print something a little bit more positive for Toronto at this point. If we turn to the next chart, please. Now, of course, one of the biggest issues facing financial markets, the economy, and what the Bank of Canada is facing right now, it's been in all the headlines, is this 30-year high that we're facing on the inflation front. First of all, I'd just like to point out that Canada is certainly no outlier here. You can see that our inflation rate is very similar to Europe. Britain, we're actually a little bit below the US at this point. Almost every major economy in the world is facing a serious uptick in inflation. There are a variety of reasons. There's no single one factor that has caused this run up in inflation. Some are structural, some are just cyclical, some are clearly related to the reopening of the economy. For instance, airfares and motel rates have popped more than 20% in the past year. So there are clearly some short-term effects at play that will fade, but there are a few factors that are a little bit more lasting. And while we do see inflation fading somewhat over the next couple of years, I think a very key point here is even by the end of 2023 and 2020, even looking out into 2024, we still believe that inflation will be higher than in the years before the pandemic. And I think that is quite a remarkable outcome, given the fact that the global economy just went through the deepest downturn of the post-war era, and we're coming out of it on the other side with higher underlying inflation. And I will add that our relatively muted inflation outlook by the end of this year and into next year is based on the assumption that energy prices stabilize and that some of the supply chain issues that we've all been dealing with do eventually improve over the next 12 months or so. If we're wrong on either one of those fronts, then inflation is going to prove to be even stickier than what I have forecast here in front of you. Just regionally, you can see Ontario's rate is even a little bit above the national average, and a lot of that speaks to just the underlying strength in home prices, which feeds into inflation in a very indirect manner. If we turn to the next chart, please. Looking ahead, a couple of reasons why we think that inflation may prove to be a little bit stickier than is commonly believed. On the one side, we are just only now beginning to see some upward pressure in wages. I talked earlier about how the unemployment rate is almost all the way back to pre-pandemic levels. Well, we're actually starting to see very real labor shortages. If anything, they're actually more intense in the US than they are in Canada. The percentage of job openings is very high in Canada, but it's even higher in the US. And we're actually seeing a bit of divergence on the wage front as well. In Canada, wages are actually still relatively tame. They're rising roughly between 2.5% to 3% at this point. In the U.S., it's more in the 4 to 5% range that wages are rising at this point. And we suspect that given this leading indicator of strong job openings, we're likely to see more upward wage pressure in the year ahead, which eventually will feed back into somewhat stronger underlying inflation pressures over the next year as well. If we turn to the next chart, uh, the other factor that I think still has a little bit of sting in its tail for the inflation outlook is just this underlying strength in home prices. Now, every country in the world treats housing a little bit differently in how it enters its basket of consumer prices, but the one commonality is it takes time for a boom in home prices to fully be reflected in the consumer price basket. And part of that is because not every one of us buys a house every year. We might not even buy a house every 5 or 10 years. So appropriately so, it does take time for a boom in home prices to be fully reflected. And certainly we are seeing broad-based strength in both Canada and the US. Just a quick word on home prices. At this stage, the imbalance between sellers and buyers is so strong, even with a small backup in interest rates, it still looks like there's quite a bit of underlying pressure on home prices. If we turn to the next chart, please. Just as one way to look at it, if we look at sales to new listing ratios, and this is just for the GTA, they're still well above their long-term trend. They actually did dip a little bit in the month of December, but overall, the underlying trend on that front still shows an extreme imbalance in the housing market, which still points to higher prices yet. Now, I do believe that as interest rates rise over the next year, this will help somewhat calm the market. But at this point, we still believe that prices retain quite a bit of underlying momentum. If we turn to the next chart, please. Just on the interest rate front, and the inflation story I spoke to earlier has certainly changed the picture on the interest rate front. Many forecasters actually believe the Bank of Canada will begin raising interest rates as early as next week. The specific timing is still a little bit up in the air. I personally believe that they'd like to see a little bit more information on exactly how some of the Omicron restrictions are affecting the economy before they move on rates. But it really is only a matter of time. At this point, we are looking for 4 interest rate increases from the Bank of Canada for a total move of a percentage point. And frankly, I would view that almost as a minimum. If anything, the risk to that call are that the bank will actually move a little bit earlier and raise the rates a little bit further over the next year. Certainly, we've seen a huge change in the language from the U.S. Central Bank, from the Federal Reserve. Looks like they will begin raising interest rates as early as March. And the conventional wisdom there too is that the Fed will raise rates by at least a percentage point this year and continue raising rates into 2023. And frankly, this is all related to that dramatic change that we've seen in the inflation landscape over the past year. Now, those are just the very short-term interest rates. The longer-term interest rates are likely to approach 2%, we think, in the days and weeks ahead. And then we see them punching a little bit above 2% by the end of this year, but not dramatically different from where we stand today. Turning to the next chart, please. Just in terms of what this means for the Canadian dollar, our core view is that the Canadian dollar is more likely to strengthen rather than weaken over the next year. We don't see a big change by any means. The interest rate environment I just spoke to is largely already baked into the current pricing on the Canadian dollar. Our longer term view is for the Canadian dollar to settle more into what we believe is Its fair value range of between 75 to 80 cents. But for this year, we do believe that the Canadian dollar is more likely to strengthen slightly rather than weaken. If we turn to the next chart, please, the last couple items I'd just like to point to is on the broader picture of government finances. Of course, we heard from Ottawa with their fiscal update in late December. No major changes on that front. We have seen the budget deficit basically cut in half in the current fiscal year. In the coming fiscal year, they expect it to be cut in less than half again to around $60 billion, and then the year after it'll be closer to where it was before the pandemic began again. Just in terms, one question I've gotten almost since day one of the pandemic is how are we going to pay for this? Will the federal government have to dramatically raise taxes in the years ahead? The one thing I would point to is that revenues, even at the federal level, are essentially back, if not above pre-pandemic levels. Really, what's the outlier there, especially when we look at it as a share of GDP, is spending is still well above pre-pandemic levels. I'd also just point to the chart on the right. We did see a one-time big step up in debt to GDP, but the debt ratio is still well below the bad old days of the mid-1990s. It's well below a typical G7 economy at this point. And of course, the interest rate landscape, we're in a very different world than we were back in the 1990s. And based on the federal government's projections, this debt GDP ratio will come down. And the final point I'll make is on my next slide, please, is realistically, the federal government really has shouldered almost the entire burden fiscally in terms of the pandemic. The provincial numbers have come in a lot better than expected. We've seen downward or improved revisions on provincial budget deficits since the start of the fiscal year. If you look at the total combined provincial budget deficit, it's about 1.5% of GDP. Before the pandemic began, it was about 1% of GDP. So we actually have provincial finances overall have actually managed through this very well. Simply because revenues have come in much better than initially expected, and effectively, as I said, Ottawa has mostly shouldered the burden of the costs. That's it for the formal part of my presentation. I'd welcome any questions at this point if there's any other topics you'd like me to dig into. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Porter, for your excellent presentation. And having won all the numerous awards on forecasting and so on, I can tell you I feel really comfortable with respect to your forecast, particularly on the situation with respect to the federal government and the debt there. Members, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions of Mr. Porter. Vice Chair Grimes, you may proceed, and then Councillor, let me just see if there's any visiting members wishing to ask questions first. Foremost, okay, I see none on my screen. So we will start with Vice Chair Grimes and then Councillor Carroll. Vice Chair Grimes, you may begin. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Mr. Porter, you mentioned the supply chain. I guess you're following that quite closely with the new policies the federal government's bringing in on the testing for drivers. Loads coming out of California are almost, approaching, 40% increase in the rates, and U.S. drivers not wanting to come to Canada. Where do you see that supply chain with the driver issue heading? Can you touch on that, or can you answer that?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thanks for asking that specific question on the supply chain, because that's clearly played a role overall in bumping up in inflation over the past year in both Canada and the U.S. First of all, one point we would make is that by many measures, and you touched on it, supply is actually operating an all-time high. There was a statistical yesterday that the volumes handled by LA ports last year were actually up 13%. Despite all the snarls. And one point I'd make is there are two blades to the scissors on this problem. One is the supply side, but the other is demand. We've just had this overwhelming demand for goods globally because people have been channeled. They haven't been able to spend on services. They haven't been able to spend on going to a Leafs game or going to a restaurant or traveling. So they've been channeled into buying goods. And we've seen this globally. There's just this wave of demand for electronics, for furniture, for appliances, and it's swamped the existing supply chain. So the supply chain didn't have a chance against this global wave of demand. Certainly there are specific supply chain issues, and I am concerned about this particular decision by the federal government at this time when the supply chain is so badly strained. I'm not sure if you saw the Globe and Mail editorial today, but they actually, even they question the timing of this decision when the supply chain is so fraught. Um, you know, it's at the very least, it's going to put more pressure on a wide variety of goods. I'm concerned that particularly on imported food, when we're already facing some sporadic shortages in various goods, it's just going to lead to more shortages and probably more price spikes in particular food items. I'm not convinced it's going to lead to a broad-based issue on food prices, but at the very least, it's going to aggravate what's already a pretty fraught situation on food imports in particular.
Great. Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Porter.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Grimes. Councillor Carroll.
Thanks. Good morning, Mr. Porter. The Globe and Mail this morning talked about the interest rate increase that the Bank of Canada said they'd maybe wait till March because of Omicron. And this morning in the real estate section, they said they're showing signs that he may proceed within a week or so. Is that just sort of real estate wishful thinking? Is that why I'm reading it on that page?
So it's interesting, and thank you. There's a very active debate right now. I mean, frankly, I think this is a little bit of how many angels on a pin on the timing of when the first Bank of Canada interest rate hike will come. They're basically, if you look at the major forecasters, it's basically a split decision on whether they're going to hike it next week or at their next meeting in March. I think the key point here is interest rates are going up this year. I think that's really the important point at this stage, and the timing is really not that significant whether they wait 6 or 7 weeks or not. I think a more interesting question is as well is how far is the Bank of Canada going to have to ultimately take interest rates to help cool inflation? Now, of course, the Bank of Canada cannot diverge that much from the U.S. Federal Reserve. So to some extent, this is a decision that ultimately might partly or mostly come out of Washington. The bank can diverge a little bit from the Federal Reserve, but not in a significant way. I believe we're probably looking at, as I mentioned, 4 interest rate hikes this year for a total of 1 percentage point move, and then probably a little bit more in 2023 when presumably we're largely past the pandemic.
Right. I want to turn to the jobless rates. Well, actually, the jobless rates and job openings. It is a spectacular rise, but the question always comes: what kind of jobs? And in terms of Build Back Better, have we learned our lesson? And jobs are going to provide more permanence and pensions. And I ask that because I see job openings not being taken up. And I've talked to young people who have said, yeah, it's a risk to work on this startup that might not pay off, but why should I apply for postings that offer me no permanence, that are 1 year and 2 year contracts for large corporations? I'm tired of that. So I'm wondering, in this COVID context, where in terms of large corporations and the C-suites, many of them have doubled their wealth during COVID. Can they not start to offer more quality jobs with more permanence and pensions?
So it's a very interesting question, and first of all, I'm quite cautious in terms of saying X, Y, or Z has changed as a result of the pandemic, but I do think what's fairly clear is that the pendulum is actually starting to swing somewhat in favor of the worker, simply because there is such a shortage of both skilled and unskilled workers at this point. It's a little bit of a different picture between Canada and the U.S. You've probably heard the phrase "the Great Resignation" or "the Big Quit." That's actually much more of an issue in the U.S. than it is in Canada. Canadians have generally stayed better engaged in the labor force than in Canada, but there are a lot of vacant jobs, and I think it does give much more power to the worker. They can be a little bit more choosier, and I think over the next year we're not only going to see a little bit of upward pressure on wages, but we're basically going to see potential workers being able to be a bit more picky and choosy about what positions they take, and will be able to demand somewhat better conditions overall. So to your point, I think I'd be a little bit on the optimistic side, and partly as a result of what's transpired during the pandemic.
Is there a way that we can track that here in our own economic development department? Do any of the trackers of the jobless rate and employment, do they break it out such that we could be tracking the increase, but also watching whether or not there's any shift going on? Do they track, temporary and part-time jobs versus more permanent types of employment?
So the short answer is yes. Not to a great detail, but the monthly labor force survey does break it out by self-employed and part-time jobs and full-time jobs. The quality of the jobs, that's a little bit tougher to measure. But of course, one way to look at it is if you dig into the payroll report, which comes out a couple months later, just simply looking at things like pay, average hourly earnings is. And they try to keep it adjusted for for shifts between sectors and whatnot. That's probably one of the best measures, timely measures we have out there. So that's something I think we can track, and it's something certainly I'll be keeping an eye on in the year ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll. Mr. Porter, thank you. My big question was around Councillor Ford, okay, I did see your hand. Please go ahead, please. I'll reframe and I'll ask my questions later on now that I've seen your hand. So please go ahead, Councillor Ford.
No
You have 5
problem,
minutes.
thank you. Good morning, Mr. Porter, and thank you very much for such an insightful presentation. I guess my question is I'd like to get your take on how government, all 3 levels of government, the city, the province, and the federal government, around kind of pandemic policy, and how we've helped support the economy through a number of measures, whether it's the federal government CERB program, the provincial government's grants and loans. How has that helped the economy through the last couple of years? And what would you recommend to governments in terms of what type of policies we could put in to help continue strengthen our economy in the years ahead?
Thank you very much for that question. That, of course, that probably deserves more than one full session unto itself, especially the second part. But very briefly, this was a truly unique cycle from many respects. Not just the circumstances, but the policy response. And I would say, this is not just a story in Canada. I think it's a story certainly in North America, but even arguably globally, is that the policy response was like nothing we've seen before. It was overwhelming. It helped avoid a terrible situation for the economy. We got out of the recession very quickly. I remember during the depths, many economists thought we would never see a V-shaped recovery. It was very close to a V-shaped recovery. Obviously not in the sectors that are still restricted to this day, but in the rest of the economy, it came back very quickly. And much of it spoke to the fact that disposable personal incomes were so well supported. Household finances are coming out on the other side of this as a whole, not every single household, of course, but as a whole, in better shape than they went in the pandemic. That is a remarkable outcome. And it speaks to the overwhelming support that was offered, especially at the federal level, but also at the provincial and the municipal level as well. I would say, though, that the time has come for policy to be much more targeted and really just be directed at the sectors that are being directly affected by current restrictions and other, special or specific policies, basically need to be unwound. There was actually just a report from the Parliamentary Budget Office that came out yesterday that basically made that same point, that the need for any extra stimulus above and beyond direct support to directly affected sectors is no longer required and actually may be counterproductive at this point because of the inflation pressures that are now starting to build because of the extreme level of demand that we've got in the economy at this point. I don't think I don't think time would give me the justice to answer the second part of the question. That's a very different issue. But from first and foremost, I think we have to get out of the pandemic first, and I think policy really should be directed at supporting the sectors that are still dealing with with the restrictions at this point. There's a completely separate track in terms of how we can in the years ahead, how we can basically build this the circumstances or the backdrop that's the most conducive to firmer growth later on. That's a much bigger discussion, I think, than I could handle in the it looks like 1 minute that I have available to me. But thank you
No
for
worries.
that question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Porter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Councillor Ford. Mr. Porter, we're going to definitely have to invite you back because I have to tell you, this is not only entertaining, it's very informative as well. I know my colleagues are definitely interested in speaking with you further. I wanted, if I just take a couple of minutes to ask you a couple of questions. I know one of the big questions I had, I think you've already answered it, it's around the federal debt and, paying for it and so on. And you talk about the increase in revenues and so on. But I wonder if you can maybe I can just ask you all three of them because I think they're closely aligned. I wanted maybe to ask you if you could identify the area in the sectors where you see the most growth taking place in the economy, and then talk a little bit about maybe the future of work, as well as I wanted maybe if you could address the transformational changes that are going to take place with respect to varying sectors. So I look at the automobile sector, for example. If you went to buy a car today, they will say, well, you can order it and you get it delivered in 6 months and so on. That's going to be a transformational change for a variety of reasons. I suspect that there'll be savings on the dealers side and so on, whether or not those will be passed on to the end users, the consumers and so on. So I wonder if I can just get you to encapsulate those three items and maybe just comment on those.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'll work backwards. Starting on the auto sector, just to be clear, Canadian auto production actually fell to its lowest level in 50 years in the past year, even lower than during the pandemic when the industry was essentially shut down for 2 full months, lower than back in 2008, 2009, when the sector was on the precipice. And it's clearly the chip shortage that's been at work here. It's not because of a lack of demand. People want cars, they want trucks. They can't get them because the automakers can't build them because they don't have the semiconductors. Eventually, this situation will sort itself out. Part of the reason why we have a chip shortage is because it goes back to my story about the overwhelming demand for goods, for electronics, that we've seen globally. As people shift slowly but surely back to services spending, they get all the electronics they want and need. The chip shortage will eventually sort itself out, and I think at that point we're actually going to have a bit of a boom in auto production and sales in the next couple of years. It won't be long lasting, but there is a lot of pent up demand for vehicles that will lead to at least a short term boom at some point in the next couple of years. That turns me to the which sectors are going to see or have the best potential. You probably heard the phrase of the K-shaped recovery. How some, I think it actually that description applies best to the sectors of the economy. Some thrived and had a quick V-shaped recovery. Others are still wallowing along at the bottom. The sectors that have been shut down, the hospitality sector, the travel sector, things like conferences and that sort of thing, they will eventually return to something close to normal. It may take a couple of years, but they're again, there is a wealth of pent up demand on that front. I don't think that necessarily speaks to their longer term outlook, but I think at least over the next couple of years or so. Longer term, I think the sectors that have some of the growth potential are all the ones we know and love. The tech sector, for instance, I still think if you think of the education sector broadly, it's got very good long run potential as well, I believe. The one I'm a little bit concerned about, at least over the short term, is the real estate side. Of course, it just had a tremendous run. There's still, hundreds of thousands of units in this country that are still under construction. I still think it's got a great tailwind, but if we look a little bit further out as interest rates go up, it's certainly a sector that, at the very least, will eventually flatten out for a spell. In other words, the massive tailwind behind it will somewhat recede. I guess the last point I'll touch on very briefly is in terms of federal debt. There was a tremendous cost to federal coffers from this, but the reality is we were blessed with very strong finances at the federal level going into this, and this is exactly why you want to have strong finances when the sun is shining, so that you can afford a crisis like we were dealing with in 2020. And Canada, I think, has come out on the other side of this in still relatively strong shape compared to most other major economies. I do think, in the next couple of years, we do need to get our fiscal finances at the federal level in particular in stronger shape to deal with the next crisis down the line.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Porter. Those are all my questions, and I know that my colleagues and I have thoroughly enjoyed your presentations and your outlook in terms of looking ahead in the economy. This is very good for helping us in terms of setting the table here in our Economic Development Department and the work that this committee does and will do going forward. Your input and your advice and the information that you have provided us here is not only stimulating, it is actually a terrific point of I guess for our starting the year 2022 in terms of moving forward. So I would like to keep open our channels of communications and the door open. We would love to have you back, and perhaps with some of the questions that have been asked by my colleagues, and we didn't have time to get too much into them today as such, although you have given us great depth and breadth of your wisdom. We appreciate your contribution to this committee today, and your contribution in general, and we appreciate your expert advice, and we wish you well. And thank you very much for your presentation to us today, and I wish you a wonderful 2022. Stay healthy, you and your family, all the best, and we would like to see you again before the year ends. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate having you. So members, all those in favor,
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Vice Chair Grimes. All those in favor of moving receipt of Mr. Porter's excellent presentation. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Thank you, Mr. Porter. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. You're welcome. So members, we will now move ahead to the balance of the agenda. And the next item that we will be attending to is EC 27.1. This was an item that we had deferred from our December meeting. It is the overview of employment lands in the area south of Eastern Avenue. I saw Mr. Cantos's name earlier. I don't know if there is anyone else with him to present, whether or not Ms. Vombakis is with him as well. So I can't see everyone on my screen at the moment when I'm looking at the names. I see Jeff now. Jeff, good morning and welcome to this committee that you are no stranger of. I think you are making the presentation. I don't know if you're accompanied by anyone, but you're here. We welcome you to this committee. So you may proceed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I am joined with my counterparts from Economic Development and Culture Division, but I'll be giving the presentation and they'll help me field your questions. And I'll be, one of my colleagues will be sharing her screen to put up. So again, thank you again for having me. And like Mr. Chair, as you mentioned, this was a presentation intended for the December meeting, but I will be giving it today. And as you mentioned, my name is Jeff Cantos. I am with City Planning and the manager of the official plan team. And we are working on the municipal comprehensive review and the conversion request of employment areas very closely with our counterparts in Economic Development and Culture Division. Now, the next slide, just a brief overview. This is about a 10-minute presentation. I'll just take you through some of the citywide and provincial interests on employment lands. We will then zoom into south of Eastern, and then talk about employment land conversions and give you a sense of next steps. And on the next slide, so why are employment lands important? So we as planners, we work in a policy-based system. So we first look to the Ontario Planning Act, and the province through the Planning Act defines employment areas as lands designated in an official plan for clusters of business and economic uses, including manufacturing uses, warehousing uses, office uses, associated retail uses, and ancillary facilities. So all municipalities in Ontario, we do take our cues from the Planning Act. And for the City of Toronto, in our official plan, we have policies that implement the legislation where the intent of our official plan policies are to protect these lands. And why do we do that? Some of the bullets on the screen is that these lands are vital to Toronto's economy and future economic prospects. They are critical They are critical support to maintaining a diversity of employment opportunities for Toronto residents across the city. They provide the only viable home in the city for businesses that require separation from residential uses and other sensitive uses because of noise, odor, and other adverse effects. And the Toronto official plan restricts residential uses to provide this land use certainty for businesses to be able to make long-term investments in the city of Toronto, knowing full well that their neighbor won't be potentially a residential condo that might complain about the noise or the smell that their or truck traffic that their business creates. So on the next slide, again, we look to the province's policies, and so on the top map, the province sets out what are called provincially significant employment zones within the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. So that's the map at the top. And so this is the province's regional plan for employment lands, and it's our responsibility as a municipality to demonstrate that we have a plan that conforms with the provincial plans. And so when you zoom in to the south of eastern area at the bottom, again, these provincially significant employment zones are defined by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing in consultation with municipalities for the purpose of setting out long-term plan for job creation and economic development. And these provincially significant employment zones can consist of employment areas as well as mixed use areas that contain a significant number of jobs. Again, that's the province's definition. So you'll see the City of Toronto outlined in red, and then the zoom in of the south of eastern provincially significant employment zone at the bottom. And on the next slide, we go to from regional planning down to the municipal planning. So in the Toronto official plan, we have two types of employment lands. We have general employment areas and core employment areas. In ROP, they account for about 8,100 hectares of land across the city, which is about 13% of the city's land base, but accommodate 26% of all the jobs across the city. And this land base is finite in nature. And again, the 26% of all the jobs across the city, they do a lot of heavy lifting. And what we have found is once these lands are converted from this employment protection, or for example, introducing residential on them, they almost never come back to their economic function, which is protected. These lands also provide low barrier entry jobs for newcomers to Toronto and other essential workers. More often than not, newcomers to Toronto don't have their professional accreditations acknowledged upon arrival. So these lands again provide those economic opportunities for those Torontonians and newcomers. Now, in the next slide, we'll zoom in to the south of eastern area, the south of eastern employment area. It's about 135 hectares in size. We've retained Hemson Consulting to do an analysis of all of our employment lands citywide, and some of the stats they've provided us is for south of eastern, there are about 4,600 jobs in 2021, which has increased since for the last 10 years, and increasing 39%, sorry, in 10 years increased by 39%, which is about 2.1% per year, with a slight drop in 2016. Another metric we use to analyze the success of employment areas is the value of the building permits within the geography. So in the south of eastern area, the value of non-residential building permits between 2016 and 2021 was $29 million. So this data point demonstrating a significant level of investment into the south of eastern area. And there is about 2.13 million square feet of rentable industrial building space and an average vacancy of 1% in 2021. And on the next slide is the intersection of south of eastern employment area and the film industry. So we at City Planning with Economic Development, we know the importance of the film industry to the city's economy and the role that it plays. Especially here, given the cluster and range of film production studios that supports other supporting businesses outside this employment area into the neighboring communities. We also know that there is over $2.2 billion in film, TV, and digital media production investment in the city, which is an increase of 13% from the previous year. We also know this represents about 35,000 jobs and 1,500 screen projects citywide each year. We also understand that the film industry is expected to grow its studio space by 63% in the next 5 years. 2 more slides, and on the next slide, looking at the conversion requests that we've received in the South of Eastern employment area. So this official plan review that we're undertaking is a landowner's opportunity to request the city to consider permitting uses that aren't otherwise allowed, for example, residential. So that would be a conversion of the lands. In South of Eastern, there are 4 conversion requests, one at the East Harbor site, one at 629 Eastern, the next 65 to 87 Heward Avenue, and the last at 17 Leslie Street. So again, the proposals here that we're undertaking the review of, city planning with our colleagues in economic and development, we are reviewing 140 of these conversion requests across the city, and we bring what are called preliminary assessments to Planning and Housing Committee for the basis of consultation, and then we'll do our outreach with the proponents, with neighboring industries, with the communities, with you, the councillors. We've met with a couple of you already, and we will bring forward a final report through to Planning and Housing Committee to City Council for Council's adoption, and the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing is the approval authority here. So the next step slides, which is date. So the staff reports on conversion requests and preliminary assessments, they go to Planning and Housing Committee. We brought one forward to the January meeting. We brought 40 of them to January. We'll bring about 40 again in February, February 15th meeting. And then the last batch of about 50 to the March Planning and Housing Committee, after which we will do our engagement. And we're also undertaking some sector-specific engagement to talk to sectors out there like food and beverage, fashion apparel, industry, as part of the broader employment study. After which we'll bring some draft policies to council in the next quarter or so. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and have my economic development colleagues to join. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Councillor Fletcher first and foremost to see whether or not she has questions, visiting member. Councillor Fletcher, you may begin, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm just going to take a little boo here at page 6, which is the 135 acres I've converted, 135 hectares, 333 acres, 4,600 jobs 2 years ago. And that was quite an increase since 2011. I think that was the increases since the conversion attempt for the mega mall, correct? That was the OMB hearing was in that. That was post OMB hearing, that increase.
That's to the chair, that's correct.
And then page 7 shows, I want to be clear when it says employment, the film industry represents over 35,000 jobs and 1,500 screen projects. That's a total for the city. That's not all in South of Eastern, because I got a little confused there. I would be very excited if it was all there, but I think it's a city total, right?
To the chair, yes, I believe that's meant across the city.
Across the city.
With a concentration in South of Eastern.
And that the actual 2 locations that are here that are directly related to film with a conversion, one 629 Eastern and the other is the Heward Avenue. Both of those are film conversion requests for filming purposes, correct?
Through the chair, yes, I believe on those sites are existing studios.
And I believe it was in a previous document that between those 2 sites, there's over 700 film jobs associated with the 2, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with that number, or if we could make sure we find that exact number.
We will find that number, Councillor, through the chair.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. Speak when my turn can come, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fletcher. Looking to see whether or not anyone else has questions on this item. Yes. Oh, Vice Chair Grimes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Jeff, hi, Jeff. Do we have any standard? We stand there and protect these employment lands. That's your job as the manager, Jeff. So, you know, the lands that are controlled, that the city owns, that we give to Create Two, is there any standard, like per acre, how many jobs we want to put on these lands? And I take it to, 20 acres we had in South Togo, we gave it away. And on 20 acres, it was worked out like 150 jobs, which to me is ridiculous. We stand there, protect these lands, but is there any standard we have when it's controlled by the city, we give to Create what we expect to get off these lands in job numbers?
Through the chair, we don't have a standard. We do take it on a site-by-site basis because some sites may warrant more or less than another, but no, there is no specific standard that we would apply to city-owned lands that we then shift over to Create.
Do you think we should have a standard in lands that we control?
But potentially a minimum standard that can vary through the chair. But that then I'm basically telling you that it is on a site-by-site basis. Access to transit, access to it depends.
But so right now we're just kind of taking the money. Someone comes in and buys the land. They say we're putting this up. Yeah, we'll take the money and run. But where there's no real job standard, what we expect on those lands.
Through the chair, my advice would be that we should be securing a significant number of jobs and leave it at a general contextual analysis, so it can be on a site-by-site.
So just in your opinion, 20 acres of land we gave away for 150 jobs. You think that's acceptable? The city on city-owned land?
I don't think that would reach the significant.
Great. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Grimes. Just looking at the screen to see if there's any further questions. Jeff, just a couple of.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I have questions.
Oh, is that Councillor Carroll? Sorry, I'm not able to see you. Councillor Carroll? Yes, please go ahead, please, Councillor Carroll.
Yes, thank you. If I could just follow along that track. While there are no, number by number specific employment job guidelines, we have classified forms of employment. For instance, you have some definition of employment such that, if you have an employment zone and someone says, I want to put a long-term care home, that doesn't fit. So there is some classifying of jobs and the scale and scope of jobs you expect to encourage on an employment zone once you have achieved the designation. Is there not?
Through the chair, if we're specifically talking about employment areas, so those lands that are protected, then it depends on the type of job, right? Like manufacturing.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
So manufacturing use is land consumptive, fewer jobs per hectare, versus an office, which is not as land consumptive, can be taller and has a higher jobs per hectare ratio. So what we are doing as part of our review in our employment study is to set minimum jobs per hectare in our employment areas.
Right. But you would relate it to the sectors you're trying to attract. So for instance, if an employment land is only attracting 150 jobs, that doesn't sound great. But if it's something in the industrial sector that we want going on in Toronto, then the number of jobs doesn't matter so much as the type of job and the type of enterprise that's now contributing to the city's economy. Is that not the case?
Through the chair, that's correct. The city of Toronto at the moment does have a very diverse economy, that we have high sector jobs and we have manufacturing and low barrier entry jobs, as I mentioned in the presentation. And it is this diversity of our economy that the previous presenter was talking about that helps us weather the storm when we do have economic downturns.
Right. And I wonder if I could just ask, does it help us when we go forward and we ask the province to bless this designation? Is extra weight lended to the fact this is a very unique employment land in that a substantial amount of the sector lives very close to the district, which is you know, somewhat unique. We can actually say that the studio district is studio district in both the employment endeavors and the fact that it has a concentration of people living near it. And that's why it's an extra reason why we really want to preserve it. Is that meaningful when we go to get this designation approved?
Through the chair, yes, it is very meaningful, and we are completing the analysis of the direct correlation of how close people live to where they work, and then when you supplant actually the transit bus lines, there is a very clear connection, and the ridership on those bus lines that we saw in the northern part of the city, that the Finch, Shepherd, Steeles bus routes were the busiest throughout the pandemic, bringing people to their place of employment as an essential worker.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll. And I'm just looking at my screen to see if any other members have any questions. I see none, but if I have missed you, please just unmute your mic and just inform me, please. I'll just wait for that. I'm waiting. Okay, I think I've got everyone. Jeff, just a couple of quick ones for me, please. How many MCR requests do you have currently as part of the process that you have ongoing?
To you, Deputy Mayor, at the moment we are reviewing approximately 140, plus or minus.
140.
Yes.
Okay. So can I then ask you, there are, and in particular in my ward, I have at least one specific situation where our staff have indicated an interest with respect to the owners of the land. Have come forward and asked for the conversion to take place because the only I guess development that's possible is a storage facility that would provide maybe 2.5 jobs, and other options would provide more jobs, but it requires a conversion. I'm just wondering, how do you deal with that? Because I would view that as being a situation where if you have 2 jobs where you had a conversion that would create, let's say, 100 jobs, that we would want to look at the conversion. And of course, in terms of balancing that. So how do you make the decisions in terms of deciding on, well, we'll just go for 2 because of our definition in terms of employment land, whereas we could have had otherwise 100 jobs, and let's say the 2 jobs that would be there, it's not the kind of use the community is supportive of, because the community's input is quite limited, or is it, as part of your process?
Through the chair, we look at them on a very case-by-case basis. We work very closely with our ECDEV counterparts to consult with neighboring industry. So if residential is being proposed, we need to make sure that that residential is compatible with the nearby industry. We don't want to be putting out manufacturing jobs out of compliance from their environmental certificates, and we will meet with those neighboring industries just to make do the very careful consideration to make sure that we're bringing good planning recommendations to City Council. And again, the net benefit of significant number of jobs is always the bar that we want to be applying.
Right, but a storage facility would not be considered a manufacturing job, would it?
Through the chair, no, it wouldn't. But there are times where a self storage, can be seen as an interim use, as a
Okay.
it's not.
So really, we're talking about the overall long-term protection of the actual site itself for the interests of employment. So it's not just necessarily that you're looking at the interim or the current use. It's more the long-term aspect. That's what you're looking at as part of the work that you do.
That is yes, that is part of the work we're doing, given that the provincial forecast for population and job growth that we're required to demonstrate we have a plan for goes out to 2051.
Right. Okay. And my final question to you, and this is just in terms of conversion aspect, I'm wondering, are you seeing a situation where employment lands were converted, and is there a request to convert it back to employment land now, considering the fact that in terms of the real estate sector, those lands are sort of in high demand at this point? I'm just wondering if you see any changes taking place there.
Through you, Chair, the only time I've ever experienced that was up in North York when Sanofi Pasteur, bought a property and requested to make it employment so they could expand. Other than that, if it goes residential and it goes condominium, then we're dealing with, the condo board and all the owners. So we've never seen it come back to employment once it has been converted, save and except for the
Okay,
Sanofi example.
Thank you. I ask you that because I have a situation with 20 acres of lands that have been converted from employment to residential, and that they're asking now that we convert it back because there's a great opportunity in terms of demand that's taking place. So I'll be bringing that forward to you very shortly. So I'm happy about that, to be honest with you. All right. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your presentation. Speakers, Councillor Fletcher, will go to you as visiting member as the first speaker, please.
Facilitate a board workshop as we have not met each other.
Maybe, Councillor Fletcher, can you just turn that down maybe just a little lower, please?
My suggestion is not
Mr. Chair, yeah, I'm just
Yes.
having some issues here.
Okay, I think that's okay
conflict.
now. That's okay now. That's okay if you can maybe
And I may have
speak.
to pop off. Is anybody else speaking here besides me?
I think this is your real issue, Councillor
Okay.
Fletcher. This is
Yeah,
sort of your
thank you.
area.
I know,
Thank you.
thank you. I'll be very brief. I know you have a motion, and thank you very much. And in particular, there's this, thank you, Mr. Cantos, for coming with this presentation. The motion that you'll move is to send this over to the Film, Television, Digital Industry Board. There is this $2.2 billion that comes in from film every year, and it does have 35,000 jobs in our city. Mr. Cantos will let us know exactly the number that are in south of Eastern, quite a few attached to 629 and Heward. And it's very important. This is where our zoning matters and our planning matters and our economic development does come together around employment lands. This is how, through these 26% of the jobs and 13% of the lands. And when we talk about the type of jobs, I think Councillor Carroll has started to introduce that. These are high value jobs. They're big jobs that create good value for people, good value for the economy. Note that there has been a significant increase, almost 40% in jobs in south of Eastern since 2011 when the OMB heard the first conversion request. And you should all know the city has a fair amount of employment there. A lot of city services, all the transportation services, park services, solid waste, night collection, all runs out of south of Eastern. And it does serve all of the downtown south area, I dare say even over into Western Scarborough for different things related to parks, etc. So it's a pretty critical zone. And for the film piece, when you lose a piece of film infrastructure that's in a cluster, it has an effect. The fact of a strong cluster, and it's recognized through Film Ontario, it allows for the industry to continue to grow, but you can't lose the heart in the body. You can cut off an arm or a leg, but you can't lose somebody's heart. And the cluster that exists in the Studio District, the Portlands, is truly that cluster that will allow for that fantastic new studio. Very jealous, Deputy Mayor, of your new studio out in your employment lands. I think it's Stratagem. It's a major one. The ones in Downsview. But they're all kind of held by the fact that we have this infrastructure in the city around film that is centered in part of the city, which we should always, always, always try not to lose. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for your taking that motion for me. And I look forward to our continuing discussions. And Councillor Carroll and I are both on the film board, so we'll be seeing this again and have this discussion. But it's extremely important to protect these types of jobs, these industries. And I know you know that, Mr. Chair, so I'll stop and let you move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fletcher. Just seeing whether or not any other members wishing to speak or any other visiting members. Seeing none. Councillor Carroll?
Just a couple. I know you want to go last, so just a brief comment, Mr. Chair. With respect to with great respect to the Vice Chair's comments earlier, I take a different view. I think it's really important for us to, not to try and set bars where it's what's the number, because as Mr. Cantos demonstrated in his answers, it's never as simple as that. if we have a sector that we're trying to put aside, you could even have, you could have Amazon is now, after all of that flurry about the world's biggest distribution center, they're now starting to develop sub-distribution centers. And some of them may have between 60 to 150 jobs. But if what that does is place us as an economy in a city amenable to those types of things, provided it also attracts that business to now place some of its corporate headquarters, or their financial data processing ends up as part of our financial services and technology sector. Having the lands to be able to create the ancillary uses in some of those interests, while it may look like a small number of jobs, I think we're better off focusing on, are those quality jobs? Are we making deals with businesses as they come into town to say, we can make it really easy for you to do this if the jobs you're providing are jobs of permanence, jobs you can build a life around, so that we start to push it that way, and then come back to the business and say, this is a city that can offer you everything from our suburban employment lands for some of those large site interests, and a great labor pool for your business interests. But what they're looking for in the city of Toronto are jobs of quality, so that they can afford to work and live inside the city. We have a unique proposition. And so I don't think you want to set it by numbers. You want to set it by what is the type and quality that we're headed towards, and our planning regime has to back that up. And I hope we got some comfort from the fact that I think that's the picture that Mr. Cantos is trying to paint with the studio district and with other employment lands. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll. So I will take carriage of Councillor Fletcher's motion, which is to refer this report to the Film and Television and Digital Media Board, and then it will go to Planning and Growth from there. Fully support that, and the motion's on the screen. And I want to thank Mr. Cantos for his always excellent presentation. I do agree with Councillor Carroll with respect to the type and quality of the jobs and so on. And there's a real delicate balance that has to be achieved as part of this process. And I know that there are many people who will come forward and wish to have the lands converted, and typically the highest and best use with respect to condos and so on, and apartment buildings. And we get that, but there has to be a place to grow. There has to be a place where good jobs are actually embedded in our development, in our growth of the city. If we are going to accommodate the growth of people coming in, we also have to ensure that we plan and have the facilities to be able to accommodate the jobs and so on. I asked the questions about the storage facility. We get a lot of those, and it offers maybe a couple of jobs per se, and that's a concern. And Mr. Cantos is right when he says, that could be temporary. And we get that, but at the same time, is the definition of temporary. I mean, we're temporary in our respective positions and so on. And the fact is, you're trying to create more opportunities, more jobs. And if something comes in and you think that this is something that would be of great benefit to your community, you want to move that forward and push the envelope a little bit. But I mean, I think the MCR process, which is the 5-year review, provides a facility and so on, and the opportunity. And I know that there are a number of sites in my ward are going through that particular process right now. And it's a process that by definition looks at combination in terms of the Ontario Planning Act's definition and the appoint lands and what our city needs for growth and so on. So I also want to thank the team, Ms. Blackman and the team at Economic Development for the collaborative work, because this is important. One's on the planning side and then the other is on the economic development side, in order to ensure that there's a balance of growth and the interest in terms of how that works. Because without that, quite frankly, the livable city that we that we love and want to continue to develop and enhance doesn't work if people aren't working and we don't have the good jobs that we want to tailor for the growth and the success for this city. So I'm happy to move the item and to obviously move the motion from Councillor Fletcher. So, Madam Clerk, we just have one motion, and that is the motion that's on the screen. Members, what say you? Are you in support of the motion that's on the screen? May I ask all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And I don't think we need to do anything else with that. Am I correct, Madam Clerk?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, so that item has been dealt with, and thank you to everyone involved. Moving along with my list, the next item that I have is EC 27.5, music rehearsal spaces in the City of Toronto. Madam Clerk, I believe you have the name of speaker. I don't have that list in front of me. Wonder if you could introduce the speaker, please, and perhaps before you do that, if you can let us know how many speakers are there on this particular item.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So we do have one registered public speaker on this item, and that is Paul Ramirez from Music Needs Space TO. Paul, are you connected?
Yep.
Hi, good morning, Paul, and thank you very much for attending to the committee. I don't know if you have been on one of the virtual calls before or you've been to committee in the past, but you have 5 minutes to make your presentation. At the end of your 5-minute presentation, members and non-members of committee may have questions of you, and there'll be an opportunity for them to ask you a question and for you to respond to the questions. So I know that you can't see me, so I will give you the 30-second, when you've got 30 seconds left, I will say 30 seconds and would ask you to conclude your presentation. Again, welcome to the committee. You may begin. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks. Good morning. I'd like to thank Mike Tanner for suggesting I speak today, and I implore everyone to read the report as it's really well written and outlines the issue. My name is Paul Ramirez, and I've been a proud Toronto resident since 2011 and active musician since 2002, the year of my Juno-nominated band, the Flatliners' inception. In addition to being a Toronto musician, I have also worked in the live music industry in Toronto under many roles for the past 16 years, from stagehand to promoter representative and production manager. I'm here to shed some light on what these rehearsal spaces are and why they are so important to the music and arts community here in Toronto. These spaces are like the city's largest music venue that the public is not aware of. For context, these spaces are for the most part small windowless rooms with thick insulation, drapes, or carpeted walls to help curb the noise of drums, guitar amplifiers, and vocal PA sounds from escaping to the outside world. These spaces are either rented hourly or on a long-term monthly basis. These spaces are integral to artists who use them to hone their skills and collaborate with other artists on music and other mixed media. These spaces provide a safe, discreet, and personal setting for artists to work on their art before taking it to the stage and public. These rehearsal rooms can house an undetermined amount of artists, both in a group setting or individually. It is very common for there to be 5 or more bands or artists utilizing a single room for rehearsals. Making music for the most part is loud, and artists have found refuge for these workspaces in employment areas to escape excessive noise bylaws. The buildings that work best for these uses are usually in industrial areas away from homes and are sometimes flanked by railroad tracks or busy highways. We as musicians do not want our art to disturb the community we reside in, but we also need these spaces to be accessible and somewhat conveniently located in the city. For obvious sound and storage reasons, it is not conducive for most musicians to practice their instrument in a typical Toronto housing setting, like my instrument, the drums. Think of these spaces like a gym, which also involves equipment and excessive noise. That is not practical in most housing settings in Toronto. In many ways, these spaces are like a gym, both for your body and your mind. The mental health benefits from playing music are unmatchable. The euphoric feeling from playing music has been compared to a runner's high. It is an amazing physical and mental outlet for thousands in our city. Over the last 30 years, a company called Rehearsal Factory has grown to become the largest supplier of music rehearsal spaces in Ontario. As of this time last year, in Toronto alone, their 4 locations were home to 250 rooms, representing about 1/2 of the available rehearsal spaces in the city. In May of 2021, Rehearsal Factory announced the sale of all their locations in Ontario. As an update to the report, as of December 2021, 2 of the 4 Toronto locations and the Mississauga location have sold and closed. The 2 remaining Toronto locations remain open, but an eviction date of March 15th, 2022 has been issued to over half the tenants at the largest location on Geary Ave. As the report summary outlines, the inventory of current rehearsal spaces and the projected closing of more facilities show that the situation has become serious for musicians in Toronto, both emerging and established. Toronto's music community has become increasingly threatened by a combination of factors, including overall affordability and the gradual erosion of grassroots ecosystem of live venues, rehearsal and recording studios, and do-it-yourself spaces and events. These trends are collectively contributing to an exodus of musicians out of Toronto to other less expensive cities. All these factors will help create a void in Toronto's arts and entertainment community and will negatively impact the nighttime and gig economy that many Torontonians prosper from. I, along with a few other musicians, have started an advocate group called Music Needs Space TO. Our aim is to work with all branches of government and the private sector to bolster support for the creation and funding of these spaces. Our goal as a group is to influence a policy framework that supports future generations with public funding, offer affordable rehearsal spaces for musicians in Toronto, and help cultivate music in Toronto in perpetuity. We look forward to working with the city on this issue. I implore city staff to read this report and look for possible city-owned sites that would work for this function. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Let me check to see if there are any questions for you, sir. Looking at non-committee members, seeing none. Committee members, seeing none. There are no questions of you, sir. Thank you very much.
That's okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Members, do we have questions of staff? Okay, seeing none, I just have a quick question, and I'll refer the question to Mr. Tanner, I guess, or through Ms. Blackman. The question that I have is, how will the pilot system work? You talk about recommendation 1 in terms of looking at Section 37, community benefits and so on. And of course, that's going to change in terms of the new legislation, Bill 108, coming into effect. So Section 37 funds are going to be in, well, limited supply, and obviously the demand for the use of that is going to be great. I'm just wondering, how realistic will it be that Section 37 funding could be used to help to facilitate the issue of shortage of rehearsal space?
Through the chair, thank you, Deputy Mayor Thompson, for your question, and I'll probably invite Mike Tanner to join this call as this response to your question as well. But I'll begin by saying, the language in the report certainly is a recommendation that suggests an exploration of whether and how Section 37 tools might be used, and how those tools will explicitly commit to supporting the change that we need to see. Certainly, there's a scenario here that we're looking at where music and rehearsal facilities are really being able to be part of this larger component of the community. And I'll turn to Mr. Tanner to add some additional context here about how this might work.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks for the question, Deputy Mayor Thompson. Through you, the folks in the planning side in CEPA have said that, as Cheryl said, they would explore how the new community benefits charges may be used to support music rehearsal spaces as part of a larger category of performing arts studios that might also address shortage of practice and rehearsal space, talent development, incubation space in a broad range of the entertainment industries, and may even be managed by a not-for-profit cultural group that would perhaps be able to lease to other operators within that kind of an umbrella. It's at an exploratory phase, and we're committed to working with planning and CEPA as the new community benefits program unrolls to see what may be possible there.
Thank you very much for that. So you're looking at more integrated as opposed to specifically standalone type of application. So you're bringing all, because we have huge deficiency in terms of cultural spaces in general and so on. So you're looking at a more comprehensive approach to that. That's really what this report is really speaking to.
Yes, through you, we see from talking with our colleagues in Arts and Culture Services that this issue of space is really a broad issue across the cultural industries. We're aware of deficiencies with, as the speaker said, these spaces are almost like gyms and dance studios and places for theater and other artistic disciplines to rehearse are similarly affected. So I think a broad approach is probably the one that may be the most successful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you both for responding to the questions. I'm just seeing whether or not any members have any additional questions. Seeing none. All right. So I would just simply move the item and just to speak in support of the approach. Quite frankly, there's as Mr. Tanner has indicated and Ms. Blackman as well, there's a overall need for space for the cultural sector, and obviously rehearsal for music rehearsal and so on is one of those elements. And I think that we really need to take a really critical look at this because we are, for example, a music city. And if musicians have no place to rehearse, then it makes no sense that we would define ourselves as a music city in our relationship, for example, with Austin and so on. So it makes sense that we should pursue this, and obviously looking at what types of benefits, community benefits, we can look at to see how we can raise the necessary resources and incorporate it in our planning as far as that goes. We have a lot of development that's taking place now in the Scarborough area along the Golden Mile, and also at the Scarborough center area, the town center area, and so on. And I think that the viability of space in this area, I think, would make a whole lot of sense because we also have better and improved transit that's coming to these areas as well. So there's a lot of young, talented people in these areas all across the city, quite frankly, that we need to ensure that we create opportunities for them and not to minimize that they are impacted now. And that will have a tremendous impact on our future if we can't find the next generation of world leading musicians that are going to come out of our respective communities. We have to do more to create opportunities for them. The next Drake is just waiting to be discovered. The next Weekend, the next I guess Bare Naked Ladies and others and so on, and Junior Award winners are just waiting to be discovered, but they can't be discovered unless they can actually hone and develop their craft in order to be discovered as such. And we have a role to play with that, and I think this is really what this report is really speaking to. So all those in favor of the approving the item, opposed, that's carried. Thank you very much. Moving right along, Councillor Ainsley, we're now coming to your item that you've held is EC 27.7. I believe that was a 1 week because you had held 27.6 and you've moved that one. So we are at EC 27.7. Councillor Ainsley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask, are staff available that are going to be implementing this or hopefully implementing this process?
We have staff available. I think we have both SDFA staff and do we have SDFA staff on the floor?
Yes, Yes, Councillor Sadaranke Conde, I'm here.
Adoranke,
oh, good morning, Adoranke. How are you doing?
Good morning, Councillor, and good morning, Chair.
Nice to hear and see you again, although virtually again, unfortunately. Happy New Year.
Councillor Ainsley, just one moment, please. I wonder if we can just get Councillor Ainsley's clock started, please.
No, don't. You don't have to indulge me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Adoranke, I just wanted to ask, so from a Scarborough perspective on bringing this forward, there was an article that was done in the Scarborough Mirror last November. I was wondering if you were aware of it. It was called Scarborough Needs More LGBTQ Safe Spaces, Services and Training, and there's a youth survey done. I was wondering if you were aware of both the newspaper article and or the survey.
Through the chair, no, Councillor, I'm not aware. I was not aware of that, but Steph, our manager of the Youth Development Unit is directly dealing with this work, and certainly bringing into bear all the conversations around the community and the city would be a critical part of the work.
Okay, so maybe I could make that. I'll send that to you. It was done by an organization called Youth Link, which I'm sure you're aware of, and it was done for youth from ages 12 to 29. And the reason I'm here today is I also sit as vice chair of the city's LGBTQS plus committee. I'm sure you're well aware of that. But when I read the survey, one of the things that stood out to me was that in Scarborough, which is a quarter of the city's population, when it comes to a safe space for LGBTQ plus S plus youth, they identified Malvern Family Resource Center, Toby's Place in Birchcliff, the YAHA at YouthLink on Kennedy Road. And then I know from personal experience from youth in my ward, they also go to the Toronto Youth Metro Youth Services at Markham and Ellesmere. So I'm really hoping that in this consultation process, we'll be able to identify more places in Scarborough, and I hope that's something that you could be looking at.
Through the chair, certainly, Councillor Ainsley, we will follow up with your office and make sure that we have the information from the survey, but certainly that's part of our process, is to make sure that across the city, we're connecting with all those spaces which are relevant and pertinent to the community, to make sure that we actually hear the voices from across the city to help to inform the plan.
Okay, and Andarake, the other concern I had, I guess, was at the city side of the table, which I also raised at the committee when this was brought forward. And the example that I used is that when we do the pride flag raising, it's done at City Hall, which is great, very much appreciated. But for that same flag raising at the Scarborough Civic Center, the local youth group that meets in Scarborough actually has to go and get permission from a Scarborough-based city councillor to do that flag raising. And I'm hoping that within this process, the policies that the city tries to adhere to will also be reviewed so that LGBTQS plus youth are much more welcomed at city facilities throughout the city as well, and not just City Hall. If that can be done as well.
Through the chair, I mean, certainly, Councillor, you raise a good point, and that's certainly within scope for the work we're doing, is not only consulting with the community, but also building a plan that helps to ensure that there are welcoming spaces across the city.
Okay, excellent. Because the other thing that came out of that survey that yourself and your staff will see is, and there's a quote in the article, one of the team members said they hope that the assessment leads to more gender neutral washrooms and more local events organized for the LGBTQS plus community, both things that youth say that they want in Scarborough. If that can be looked at as well.
Through the chair, certainly, that's an aspect of what we can consider in the work.
Okay, thank you very much, Andarake. Mr. Chair, those are my questions for staff. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsley. Let me bring this into committee to see whether or not any committee members have any questions. Okay, seeing that, did you wish to speak, Councillor Ainsley? You may go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here in support of this request before you today, not only as a city councillor from Scarborough, but I'm also the vice chair of the city's LGBTQS plus committee. And the report or the news article that I mentioned in a survey that it's based on was done by an organization in Scarborough for youth from the ages of 12 to 29 that reviewed service providers. And this is something that we really need in Scarborough. And I'm sure from youth that identify as LGBTQS plus, it's something that also needs to be reviewed for Etobicoke, East York, North York, and I think parts of the downtown core. And I want to thank Anna Ronke for all of her hard work and dedication and that of her staff. I want to thank her for all of that. And I've made a commitment to making sure that she has this survey and the link to it and the newspaper article as well. And I would ask for the committee's members, support of the members of this committee to move this forward in support of our youth throughout the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsley. And as Councillor Ainsley has requested, and I think that everyone in the committee is in support of, we will ask that we take the vote on this item. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you, Councillor Ainsley. The matter has been approved by committee. All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Moving right along, members. We're now at EC 27.8, review of guidelines for the opening of City of Toronto's emergency cooling centers. We have a speaker on this item. Not sure if it's one or two. Madam Clerk, how many speakers do we have on this item? And if you would call that speaker, please, that would be helpful. Or I think there's more than one. Is there more than one?
There are two speakers in total on this item, Mr. Chair. And the first speaker is Dr. A.J. Withers, Adjunct Faculty, Critical Disability Studies at York University. Dr. Withers, are you connected?
I am, thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Withers, and welcome to committee. You will have 5 minutes to speak, and at the end of your remarks, visiting and also committee members may have questions of you. You may proceed. I will tell you at the 30-second mark before completion that you've got 30 seconds to wrap up, please. You may begin.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Thompson and members of council for having me here today. The current cooling center plan, along with the City of Toronto's overall approach to weather emergencies, neither meets the needs of unhoused people nor does it correspond to available evidence. This is why a full overhaul of the emergency cooling and warming center approach is needed, and the inclement weather program proposed by myself as lead author, along with researchers, frontline workers, people with lived experience of homelessness, and advocates in the Shelter and Housing Justice Network's emergency winter and shelter support infrastructure plan, which is enclosed in my written deputation, needs to be adopted. Last week, when we saw the most snowfall in a day that we have seen in many, many years, an unhoused person was buried in it. If not for volunteers doing outreach, that person easily could have died. That person is disabled, and there were volunteers that happened to find the person. It was another unhoused person, I believe, and volunteers that reported it. The warming center, they don't open based on snowfall warnings, only temperatures, even though heavy snowfalls collapse tents and they put people at serious risk. The city can open warming centers for this kind of weather, but it requires additional steps and is at the discretion of SSHA staff. Likewise, in the summer, which this report speaks to, cooling centers only address temperatures, not weather, which can also be deadly. Cooling centers don't open for heavy rainfall when there can be a risk of serious flooding that could break river or creek beds where encampment residents have hidden away because city policies encourage, even require invisibility. And heat alerts don't raise the alarm for thunderstorms when, especially at night, and especially when the shelters are full, which frankly is pretty much every night, unhoused people have to take shelter. People may be forced to take shelter under trees and parks, which we know is very unsafe. And just a few years ago, a friend of mine was killed by lightning strike in a city park this way. The report before you states that if COVID is out of control, only a single cooling center will be open overnight. This does not meet the needs of unhoused people. The use of the one overnight space is higher than all of the other spaces combined. This is likely indicative of both the importance of having downtown locations and especially of having overnight space. The lack of cooling spaces in 2019 was devastating to the unhoused community, and having an app available for people to find things like waiting pools where many unhoused folks are unwelcome at is simply doesn't meet this population's needs, and it doesn't meet many seniors' needs. We need an adequate cooling center system back. And we need more than that, though. We need a full inclement weather system to address the emergency weather related needs of unhoused people. So I need to apologize here. My written comments accidentally only include the weather related components of this plan, but they're included in the enclosed plan on page 11. So this inclement weather system would issue a weather alert when Environment Canada forecasts for the city of Toronto cold, which is at higher temperatures than is currently the case because we see injuries from cold, and there is significant evidence for alert for higher temperatures than -15. It would issue an alert for freezing rain, severe thunderstorms, heavy snowfall, heavy rainfall in summer, freezing rain, and heat. And this plan is research-based and will help save people's health and save
30
people's
seconds.
lives. Thank you. So I'm calling on you today to make meaningful action, pass a motion requiring staff to report on our plan, and immediately implement the cooling system program that existed prior to 2019. Other public health departments may have adopted the current cooling scheme, but they also have nearly the number of unhoused people that our city does. Toronto should be a leader, not a follower, take the lead, and demonstrate concern for the entire population of this city, not simply those with housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just check to see if there are questions of you. Yes, there are. Visiting member, Councillor Ainsley. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Withers, I wanted to ask in your written deputation, you said that city policies encourage, even require invisibility. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so encampment evictions in parks continue. And so people have been forced further and further into deep woods of the city, into remote areas. And so what that has meant is that it's harder and harder to reach people. Some of the folks who have been displaced from encampment evictions have yet to be found by the people that had daily relationships with them while they were in parks and more visible. So because of that, folks are going into more dangerous environments in order to be able to have some place to stay. And the city's discourse has been to go into quote unquote safer indoor spaces. But the reality is that the shelter system's in collapse. There aren't indoor spaces, and those spaces that people could potentially get into aren't safe. COVID has swept through the system, and there is tremendous amounts of violence and feelings of ill safety. So people have been forced to hide away from the city.
Okay. And then further in your written deputation and also in your comments, you talked about an adequate cooling system back, that the issue an inclement weather alert when Environment Canada forecasts, and then you go through some recommendations for winter in the written deputation. What would you see? Are there similar guidelines for that for the summer for emergency cooling centers that we should be following?
Yeah, absolutely. And my apologies. So I just failed to include them in the draft that I sent, which I wrote very quickly, because the shelter system is in such collapse. We're all very busy right now. But the full plan is at page 11 of the report that's included in my deputation. But for summer, they really are around heat, which corresponds to the existing plan for if of the city, but also severe rainfall. So when there's 50 millimeters or more of rain that's expected within 24 hours, or 75 millimeters or more of rain expected within 48 hours. So we're all familiar, I think, with these kind of flash massive rainfalls. And I think likely every counselor has been stuck in one of these, and they're terrible to be stuck in. So imagine not having anywhere to go or having your tent washed away. And then also thunderstorm is a particularly potentially dangerous place to be caught in if you're unsheltered. So those are the three major things in summer that are major weather hazards that we're calling on the city to adopt a plan for.
Okay, and then my last question for Dr. Withers, through you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Withers, are there other public health departments that you could point to that have adopted an inclement weather strategy as opposed to temperature?
When we were working on the report, we didn't look, to my knowledge, the next speaker may have more knowledge. To my knowledge, we didn't look at other public health departments, or I'm not aware of them. We looked at existing research that the city had done and existing research on the hazards of weather to unhoused people. And that research really points to the inadequacy of the city's research around weather and the harms of weather to unhoused people. But I'm not familiar with public health department weather plans outside of Toronto.
Okay, all right, thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsley. I'll just bring the matter to committee to see whether or not any members of committee has any questions for Dr. Withers. Councillor Cressy, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought we were going into committee for questions of staff.
No problem. We also have another speaker. So, Madam Clerk, would you introduce the other speaker, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Sorry about that. The next speaker is Sarah Rahu. Sarah, are you connected?
Okay. To the chair, Sarah is connected and unmuted. Sarah, if you can hear us, please say a few words.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Good morning, Sarah, and welcome to committee. You'll have 5 minutes to speak, and at the end of the 5 minutes, you will have an opportunity to respond to questions that non-committee members or members of committee may have for you. And also want to just let you know, I will give you the indication that you have 30 seconds left at the 4 minutes and 30 seconds mark, okay? Thank you very much. You may begin.
Good morning. Thank you, councillors, for listening and for your consideration. This is actually my first time speaking at a meeting. So my name is Sarah Rehearsal, and I am a clinical researcher who specializes in burn injuries. I am also one of the authors of the Shelter and Housing Justice Network's Winter Plan. I want to speak about opening Toronto's emergency cooling centers. First, I commend the city for opening cooling centers when 2 or more days of daytime temperatures are expected to reach 31 degrees Celsius or higher, and nighttime temperatures are 20 degrees Celsius or higher, or when humidex values are 40 degrees Celsius or more for 2 days. Today, I ask the committee to consider expanding emergency cooling center hours to 24 hours per day instead of 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. during heat mornings. The mornings can be hot and the nights can be sweltering. Currently, the city is not planning to operate the 8 fixed site emergency cooling centers in 2022. How many cooling centers is the city planning to open? I support the demands of the winter plan from the Shelter and Housing Justice Network. Importantly, this plan asks for an inclement weather program. The summer does not just bring heat, it brings severe thunderstorms and heavy rainfall. Specifically, I ask that the city incorporates the guidelines from Environment Canada for cold, freezing rain, severe thunderstorms, wind, hail, rainfall, snowfall, and heat. If you think back to this past summer, which I know might be hard given the current weather, Toronto broke a record for thunderstorms and rainfall. Imagine living outside during one of those torrential downpours from last summer. Your tent floods and your belongings, everything you have, ends up sopping wet and potentially ruined. Some of the guidelines from the City of Toronto are not based on scientific evidence. I would like to remind the committee that the City of Toronto chose -15 degrees Celsius as the temperature threshold to open warming centers after a review of the weather conditions during which 3 unhoused people died in 1995. Average minimum winter temperatures in Toronto and severe winter conditions between 1992 and 1996. A sample size of 3 tragic deaths is incredibly inadequate to make a scientifically grounded decision. I urge the councillors to take the inclement weather program into consideration, the full details of which are captured within my written deputation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let me check to see if there are any questions of you. Yes, we have visiting member, Councillor Ainsley. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sarah, I just wanted to, the previous deputy answered a lot of my questions. Dr. Withers, I just wanted to ask you, are you aware of any other jurisdictions that are using inclement weather as the bar for opening their emergency cooling centers, or do you think Toronto should be taking the lead?
I would have to double check our references. I mean, we did look at other cities and models to see how they were doing it. However, I think Toronto needs to take the lead on this. We're in a major North American city, and we have to step forward.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time this morning and all the research that you've been doing on this. Mr. Chair, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsley. Bringing this matter into committee, checking to see if there's any questions for the speaker. There are no further questions of you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your presentation, and welcome to your first committee meeting. We look forward to seeing you at future meetings, and thank you. Your presentation was excellent, and I hope that you enjoyed your experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, members, questions of staff. Visiting member, Councillor Ainsley, you may begin. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. Thank you, Chair Thompson. To staff, the reason that I brought this forward was through my experience, in particular last summer. My first question is I'm trying to figure out who's actually responsible for implementing the emergency cooling system. Last summer, I first reached out to the medical officer of health. I was directed to the city manager's office, and I believe the report that's before us today was written by Chief Pegg. So I'm trying to understand, first of all, who has ultimate responsibility for deciding on when when the center should be open.
Oh, good morning, Councillor, and through the chair, this is Jim Jessup. On the WebEx, we have Director Joanna Bevan from the Office of Emergency Management and Tyler Griffin, and I'm going to ask Tyler to respond, please.
Yes, thank you, Chief, and through the chair. The emergency cooling centers were only opened in the last 2 years, in 2020 and 2021, due to the COVID response and provincial orders closing the indoor cool spaces as part of the heat relief network. The heat relief network was established in 2018, I believe, through TPH, and that's a larger network of approximately 270 indoor cool spaces that are accessible for those seeking heat relief.
Sorry, Tyler, who's responsible for saying open them?
Opening the heat relief network. So essentially, the city follows the guidance from Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Sorry, my apologies, Tyler. I don't mean to interrupt. I don't want to sound rude, but like, which person? I know the guidelines we follow, but once we hit that mark in the guidelines, who says open the centers?
once we hit that mark for the last 2 years from an emergency perspective, the Office of Emergency Management would direct the opening of the emergency cooling centers.
Okay, and how, thank you, Tyler. And then how do we gauge? So the other problem that I had last summer was I worked my way through the system because I thought the shelters, cooling centers needed to be open. We were hitting, and I can't remember the temperature offhand. You know, it was being forecast by Environment Canada. We were going to hit, let's say, 80 degrees on a given day. And I worked my way through public health, a city manager. I think I got to the Office of Emergency Management, and I was told there was no need to open the cooling centers. And that was, I know it was 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was kind of surprised by that. And then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a media release went out saying that the emergency cooling centers were being opened. So I'm trying to understand how far ahead we look at, you know, do we say, okay, 3 days from now, Environment Canada says we're going to hit that mark, so we need to open them or prepare to open them? Or do we actually wait until Environment Canada says, you know, it's 85 degrees out, we better open them? Like, I don't understand why we don't look ahead like 2 to 3 days and prepare to open them, right?
Yeah, yes,
because in that case, somebody would have said to me at 11 o'clock in the morning, hey, counselor, at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we're issuing a warning, so we're going to open them. But instead, I got a, you know, complete contradiction to Environment Canada that we weren't going to hit that temperature that day, so there was no need to open them.
Yes, and to the chair, councillor, to your question, the Office of Emergency Management does have advance warning with the Environment and Climate Change Canada weather specialists. So we do get advance warnings days in advance. In some cases, and I think the situation that you mentioned, they were unclear if the weather would hit the mark of requiring the opening of cooling centers or declaring of a heat warning. It does take time for staff to logistically send staffing and resources to open cooling centers. So if a heat warning is declared later on in the afternoon, the locations would be open first thing the next day, with the overnight location opened as soon as possible.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That concludes your question, Councillor. You're 5 minutes and 12 seconds. So we're moving this along. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I had one more question.
Councillor Ainsley, you've exceeded your time. I'm looking to see whether or not there is any members who have any questions. If there are no members having, Councillor Cressy, you have questions?
Just briefly.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I suppose this can go to our colleagues at OEM. Hey, Tyler, Jim, and Joanna. So Tyler, you mentioned we set up the Heat Relief Network a couple of years ago, but the last 2 years during COVID, that network was impacted due to COVID restrictions. Is that why the cooling centers were opened over the last 2 years? Because the network was impacted by COVID restrictions?
Yes, Councillor, through the chair, the cooling center program was discontinued, I believe, by TPH in 2018 or 2019. Correct me. And they reverted to a cool network. So that is the network that you're referring to of those cool spaces. As you mentioned, the only reason that cooling centers were stood up was based on an emergency need, as indoor cold spaces were unavailable due to provincial closures due to COVID-19.
Okay. And do we have money in the proposed budget for these cooling centers this summer if we find they're needed?
Yes, Councillor, we do. We have funds available, and staff are in the process of making contingencies. If the ongoing heat relief network, those hundreds of indoor cool spaces, are impacted in this coming summer 2022, So we will be able to respond as necessary to ensure heat relief is available.
Okay, so there is money in the budget if we find these spaces are necessary. Okay, thank you. And I understand Dr. Shapiro from Toronto Public Health is here. And so I just wanted to make sure, Dr. Shapiro, can you comment on the heat relief strategy for this upcoming summer in the context of the heat relief network, and based on the last 2 years, the potential need for additional emergency cooling locations?
I think the strategy would be largely similar to past years in that we would emphasize the heat relief network, which has many more sites, more broadly distributed through the city, and is more accessible. And we would work with other city partners if that's not available, in terms of helping to establish cooling centers should they be necessary.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainsley. Just one question for me. I know we're talking specifically about the city's cooling centers, but Tyler, you referenced the network. How many cooling facilities and or centers are, we define them as centers, are part of that network? The network that you referenced.
Yeah, through the chair, I may defer to Toronto Public Health. At last count, I believe 270 locations were accounted for.
Yeah,
Dr. Shapiro?
I don't have an exact count. I think it's been a while. You know, we refresh it in the spring.
Is it suffice to say then there are hundreds of them available in the city of Toronto?
That's correct. I would just add that many of the locations that are used for the cooling centers are also part of the heat relief network.
Right. Okay. Okay. So to the question that was asked by Councillor Cressy, and I just want to make sure I'm clear on this, we have available funds to open facilities should they be necessary. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, Councillor, that is correct.
Right. And the availability of funds to open facilities, and facilities are open, it's predicated on, I guess, the guidelines that's established by Environment Canada?
That is correct also.
Right. One of the speakers, or perhaps both the speakers, sort of referenced the issue around inclement weather in general. And so with respect to the cooling centers, if we had a combination of rain and heat, for example, and someone were to, let's say it was very hot and the temperature changed, it got cooler, would we then be sort of displacing those individuals if they were in for the cooling facilities using for that purpose, and the weather changed, it got low? Obviously the weather changed and it was raining. Would they then be required to leave and go someplace other than the facilities that's designed as a cooling center or cooling facilities?
I'm not quite sure.
It's not a trick question. I'm just trying to understand that. Because I think when they talk about inclement weather, I gather that combination of things. Are we suggesting that we also now have to have facilities for rain for those individuals who are in need? Is this another component part of what we're looking at?
I would postulate that the existing locations are city facilities, and they would not allow people or require people to leave. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Those are all my questions. All right. To speak, Councillor Ainsley, to speak. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a motion that I believe the clerks have, and I would like to put that motion forward, basically asking for the appropriate staff, and they are listed in the motion, to report back to the Economic and Community Development Committee in the second quarter of 2022 on an enhanced emergency cooling center system, to include how cooling centers can address inclement weather, including heavy rain and flooding, and also clear guidelines for staff responsibility and implementation. And just to speak to that motion, I brought this forward here today based mainly on my experience from last summer, trying to understand how the emergency cooling center system was to be opened. I made numerous phone calls and emails before I got to a staff person who could explain on 2 instances how they opened. The opening of this on the second time, there was a lot of confusion. I don't think the guidelines were clearly in place or understood. Secondly, as somebody that has a lot of experience with inclement weather, I do a lot of camping with Scouts Canada. You know, a heavy rainfall is one thing when you're in appropriately clothed, you have the appropriate shelter. It's quite another, I think, when you would be considered homeless or living in a park, as one of our deputants referred to people as invisible because they don't want to be in our shelter system or don't feel for whatever reason they can be in our shelter system. I really think that we need to be reviewing the guidelines, especially in light of the changes, climate changes we've been experiencing lately, that we just can't rely on the temperature to decide when our emergency cooling centers are open. We also need to be including inclement weather. And also, as both of the deputants said, the City of Toronto is the largest city in Canada, needs to be taking a lead on this, needs to be example for other jurisdictions. So I'm putting forward this motion. I hope that it will have the support of the committee. And last but not least, I do want to thank all of the staff that work on our emergency management team for all of their hard work on the system, both the heat and cooling system centers, and all of their hard work they've been doing during COVID. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ainslie. Further speakers to this item? Councillor Cressy, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I have an amendment, and thank you to members of the committee and the chair for your collaboration on this, which is to amend it so that our staff consider operating cooling centers in 2022 as part of the heat relief strategy and to review usage to inform those locations. So let me take a step back here to talk about the issue, because we've spent a lot of time talking about heat at this committee and at Toronto Public Health. Heat is dangerous and can be very dangerous. Just look to British Columbia last summer and what they experienced. And it's dangerous for people. Keep in mind, we have 3,400 apartment buildings in the city of Toronto that don't have air conditioning. Residents of 3,400 apartment buildings without AC, that's very dangerous. We also have, and we've heard some deputants here, unhoused residents in our city for whom heat is dangerous. And so when we think about heat relief, we need to think about the continuum of people who need relief from dangerous heat, whether that's 25 degrees or 35 degrees. So the solution, let's be very clear, the solution, which is serious infrastructure upgrades, is tower renewal. It's serious and ongoing upgrades to ensure that people who have the privilege of renting or owning in buildings that don't have access to AC can get the necessary infrastructure upgrades to mitigate the harms. That is what climate change mitigation looks like. That's how we truly deal with heat. For those who are unhoused, housing with AC is how we truly deal with heat. So that's the solution, but we know those type of infrastructure upgrades can take time, too much time. And so in the immediate, we have a duty in the immediate to ensure that people have relief from the heat in the here and now. So in the past, if we go back in time, in the past, prior to 2018, all we did was open emergency cooling centers. That's it. That's all we did. So if you were a resident of one of 3,400 apartment buildings, you had no access to heat relief unless you went to the emergency cooling center. So instead, based on evidence around the world and best practices, we established the Heat Relief Network, more than 270 locations. And the principle here, which I think is really important because there's been a lot of talk about inclement weather, is that people need access to heat relief whether it's 25 degrees, 28 degrees, 32 degrees, or 42 degrees. Because if you're trying to sleep in an apartment building and it's deeply humid, that can have a negative consequence on your heat, even if it's only 30 degrees. If you are unhoused and it's 30 degrees, not 35, that can be dangerous, especially if you have pre-existing conditions. And so it's critically important that in establishing our heat relief network, that it's 24/7 throughout the summer, not on 15 days at 8 locations if it happened to get really hot. Now, over the last 2 years, during COVID restrictions, a lot of those locations in the heat relief network have not been accessible. They've been closed. And so our city moved to open these emergency cooling centers. And I want to speak specifically to, some of the experience I've heard and had with those who are unhoused. Because again, we need cooling centers for those who live in apartment buildings but don't have access to it. But for those who are homeless, we know that our shelter system needs to have adequate AC, and those upgrades have been ongoing. We know that the heat relief network is important, but we also know that in this heat relief network, there are some settings that frankly are not as accessible for somebody who might be living rough on the streets. And that's where emergency cooling centers as a low barrier option provide an additional layer of heat relief during those exceptional days. And I think they're important. And so it's for that reason that I've, in this amendment, asked staff to consider how the emergency cooling centers can be part of the heat relief network in 2022. We've heard that there's money in the budget already for them. And so as we work to confront heat, I think we all have to acknowledge there is mitigation, but there is long-term sustainable solutions, and we need to continue to do both. And cooling centers play a role as part of that broader network. Those are it for me. Thank you, Chair. I'll turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Councillor Cressy. All right. So we have motions from Councillor Ainsley and motions from Councillor Cressy. Councillor Ainsley, who is moving your motion?
I'm hoping, sorry,
Grimes?
I see Councillor Grimes' hand. Thank you, Councillor
Okay,
Grimes.
no, I just wondered, I just wondered whether or not you had actually asked for anyone to move it. So let's just have a quick look at your motion, and just because this is really the second time I'm seeing it, so just saw it really quickly. So just have a moment to read, please. All right, so
Councillor,
you're not asking that they be implemented.
Councillor, can I ask, Councillor Ainsley, is it friendly if we simply request staff to do this work rather than report back on it? I mean, I just want to see it done. Because I'm just conscious if the intention is, how we bring cooling centers into the heat relief network, and do you want to is it a friendly amendment to say, request staff to do this as opposed to a report back? Why don't we just do it?
I'm always happier, Councillor Cressy. I'm always happier to have staff just do it as opposed to asking for a report. So if I can have a friendly amendment that says request or direct staff to do this, I'm always much happier with that than chewing up staff time, coming back with a report with something they're willing to do.
And I see Deputy, excuse me, I see Chief Jessup nodding. So I think staff see that as friendly. Chair, if Councillor Ainsley is comfortable with that, could we change this from a report back to a request for staff to undertake?
Yes, so Councillor Cressy, you're absolutely right, because I think Councillor Ainsley is actually interested in action, in having it done, right? And I think
I'm just trying to be polite.
So. Yeah, no worries, no worries. So yeah, if the clerk would, and we see Deputy Chief Jessup is also in support of that and so on, and it's not an onerous task in order to have the staff do the things that they do professionally. They understand the direction. There's no need for a report back and so on, and just going to prolong this whole process and so on. And
that would be great.
We want to get this done. All right. So, Madam Clerk, if you could make the adjustment with respect to that friendly amendment, we would appreciate that. Maybe just give the clerk a little time in order to make the necessary adjustment to that, because that actually works well. And we'll put that in your name, Council, Vice Chair Grimes. Members,
Chair,
after
this is
this
just-
item, we have one remaining item left. Madam Clerk, go ahead, please.
Mr. Chair, if you could just give us a moment, if you could hold this item down
Sure.
and move on to the
We
next
can hold
item.
this down. Sure, absolutely. We can hold this down and move to the next item. So that's fine. Thank you. All right,
you.
members, we're moving to the next item, which is EC 27.9. It's the award request for proposal document number 30023400572 to multiple suppliers for the provision of short-term accommodations for shelter clients through the use of hotels, motels, and or approved equivalent operators. All right, so on this item, we have no speakers, but we do have visiting councillors. We have Councillor Ainsley and Councillor McKelvey. Councillor McKelvey, do you have questions of staff? All right. Does anyone else have questions of staff on this item? Okay, Councillor Ainsley, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. And it's based on the letter that Councillor McKelvey submitted on the Lido Motel. I know that the Lido has been used for a number of years as a shelter residence under contract by the City of Toronto. And I know that in previous years, there have been complaints about the cleanliness and the upkeep of the Lido, which is being raised in Councillor McKelvey's letter. I'm just trying to understand how the standards for cleanliness and upkeep are met, because this isn't the first time it's been raised. It's been, as I said, it's been raised previously, and I've had residents from that now live in my ward that lived in the Lido raise it. So I'm just trying to understand how those standards are dealt with, established, and how they're met and kept. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and through the chair, it's Gord Tanner here with Shelter Support and Housing. So Councillor Ainsley, this property, you're right, we've used this property and other motels on Kingston Road going back to 1986, and it's part of the family residence portfolio. We're currently sheltering 120 people there, and so the staff do regular maintenance checks with the property, connecting with the hotel ownership, identifying issues, and seeking those issues to be resolved as quickly as possible from the hotel ownership. I would suggest that currently we are not totally happy with the conditions at the property, and see this opportunity with the new owners at the site to seek some immediate and short-term capital upgrades to the location.
Okay. And sorry, Mr. Tanner, did you say there's new owners at the site?
Yes, through the chair, the site changed ownership just recently, and it was that ownership group that had replied to this open RFP for short-term accommodation.
Okay. And how long is our current contract with the Lido for?
We currently have a contract with the Lido that's ongoing. This RFP would replace that and bring them into a contract, but the current contract goes with value through to the end of February currently.
Sorry, February 2022.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and then if this RFP is approved, the contract would run until?
It would give us the opportunity to enter into a contract with an annual renewal for up to 5 years.
5 years. Okay. And then when you talked about staff doing inspections, sorry, how often do they go in and do inspections?
So we now have on-site staff, city staff at the property on a daily basis, and so they are there to identify issues as they come up. Room inspections are done when we turn over rooms between households as they're moving in and out of the property. Those issues are identified, documented to the owners, and sought to follow up on.
Yeah. And what are the repercussions for the owners? Like, our staff go into room 12 and it's, you know, for lack of a better word, it's a pigsty and it needs just general cleanup, or there's cockroaches, for example, or you know, bed bugs. How long does the owner have to clean that room up? And if what are the repercussions if the next family moves in and they come in and say, you know, we have bed bugs in our room? Like, what are the penalties or repercussions the owner faces?
So the contract as it's structured is that we don't have exclusive use to the property. We rent on a room by room basis. So if a room is in disrepair, we do not rent that room. It would come out of the portfolio and until it was repaired and we put it back online. But again, I think that, and I've got, you know, one of my directors here who did an on-site inspection just yesterday to bring me the latest details of the site conditions. And we would agree that there needs to be some immediate updates. And through this change of ownership and opportunity to renew this contract, we think we've got some leverage here to see those things happen in a more significant way.
But so I guess, Mr. Tanner, I'm trying to understand for the example I use, like if you have bed bugs in room 12 and we move a family out, we're renting that room, and another family goes in after the landlord says they cleaned up the bed bugs, and the next family that goes in, or an individual, and says there's bed bugs in my room. How does that addressed with the owner? Is there a penalty, or, you know, do we reduce payment for that month? How is that handled?
That's your last question, Councillor.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And through the chair, we wouldn't have a penalty. I mean, we wouldn't pay for that room, right, until it was in a state of repair that we were comfortable with. And that would be the only penalty that there would be for that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ainsley. Councillor McKelvey, you have 5 minutes.
An apology, I wasn't planning to ask questions, but the timing of the contract was not clear in the briefing I had this week. So we crafted this motion with this coming back to economic development so we could look at these provisions. It sounds like that's a problem because your contract expires next month. So how are you bridging?
So working with our colleagues in purchasing, we think we have the ability to bridge, you know, temporarily through to an opportunity to report back to you at the next ECDC committee.
Okay, because I mean, Councillor Ainsley just highlighted the problems. I've had a briefing with you already on this. I've passed these along. We do need to have a look at what that plan is. And frankly, I think we have to put the pressure on the landlord that they need to know we're all watching. And we're watching so closely that we're bringing this back to this committee because we have families living here and it's just not, it's not healthy, it's not safe. They need to make these big changes. So, okay, so you can bridge and we can have a more fulsome discussion and look again at this in March.
Through the chair, that's correct, Councillor, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McKelvey. Councillor, bring this matter into committee. Councillor Lai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want some clarification. I just heard that this shelter has been around and we have about 26 temporary shelters and hotels in the city. So is this a permanent shelter? And if so, how many permanent shelters do we have in the city?
Right, so thanks for the question, Councillor Lai. And through the chair, you know, currently we're operating 101 locations. We are operating 27 that are part of our COVID response and would be what we call somewhat temporary. 23 of those sites are hotels. The Lido falls outside of that, as do a few of the other Kingston Road motels and properties we use because we've used them for such a long time. These are I would say, going back to 86, a somewhat permanent part of our shelter system that can expand and contract depending on the demand for usually family space. But we don't have the exclusive use for this property or the other motels. We would lease rooms at this site based on the demand that we have. So currently we're using about half or just over half of the rooms at the Lido Motel.
Which is how many rooms?
The Lido in total has My apologies, just 1 second here. 60 rooms. No, the Lido has 77 rooms in total, and we are using just over 60% of them, 45 rooms.
So 60%, 45 rooms, so about $1 million a year. And are they usually filled, or what if, is it on the per use basis, or?
It's on a per use basis, Councillor. Thank you, but often these rooms are filled and turn over very quickly when there is a vacancy, and we bring in a new household into that program.
Yeah. My next question would be, if the COVID restriction are removed, some of these temporary shelters are going to be, they're going to be up for April this year, right? The leases are up to. Do you plan to turning these temporary shelters into permanent shelters?
Thanks for the question, and through the chair, Councillor, we have until this date, and working with the Housing Secretariat, actually purchased, at least one of the properties. My expectation, given where we are with the Omicron wave, as we plan to transition out of some of these sites, is that we may need to extend those leases beyond April going forward. We've built our 2022 budget with the most flexibility so that we maintain all of these sites at full capacity through this year should we need to. But certainly, would be our hope to move many of the folks in some of these programs into permanent or supportive housing over the course of this year.
Yeah, speaking of the budget, I assume, and the report that is covered, I assume that there's some of them are federal money. Is that correct?
Yes, we have used it's currently an unfunded pressure in our 2022 budget. The costs for these COVID response hotels have been covered by both funding from the province and the federal government in 2021, and ongoing conversations with both the province and the federal government continue with respect to ongoing funding for 2022.
How much would you say the ballpark figure that the city has been spending on this budget for the shelter purposes?
So with respect to our COVID response and the 27 properties, it would be 288 million that we have built into our 2022 budget.
Our own money, the city's money, is that correct?
This is an unfunded pressure currently.
Councillor Ainsley, just mute yourself there, please.
Which we hope to, seek funding to support from both the province and the federal government.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lai and
sorry, Mr. Chair.
Ainsley.
I just wanted to apologize to the committee and Councillor Lai. I was unaware that my microphone was on.
We understand, Councillor.
Just wanted to apologize.
Our apologies accepted. We understand. No problem.
Well, that was
and
because
besides,
this is the last item on the agenda. That's good.
Sorry, Councillor Lai. My apologies.
Thank you. All right. Looking at the screen, seeing whether or not there is any other members of committee with questions. Okay, seeing none. Let me just ask you, Mr. Tanner. You have I guess a sort of standard that you use in terms of determining the Toronto shelter, I guess, standards, right? Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Deputy Mayor, that's correct. Shelter standards.
Right. Is there a standard that you have that's in place as part of the overall standards that you have when you look at shelters in terms of the temporary process that we're dealing with here today? Is there an external standard that's incorporated as part of your plan?
So, the standards do provide a host of benchmarks with respect to everything from facilities to case management to basic needs that we provide. But one of the gaps currently that we're looking at certainly is the use of motel and hotel properties as part of our shelter system, and developing specific facility standards that we might apply to those types of settings that are a little bit different than some of our base shelters.
So are you suggesting at this point we don't actually have a standard with respect to hotels and motels?
We have standards with respect to the building code, fire life safety, within the contract with the providers, but not specifically built for this built form, which is something that we'd be looking to develop.
Right. Why would it have taken us to this point where we now have to develop it? I mean, would it have made sense that we would actually have a standard? So, for example, this particular facility, the Lido facility, we've heard so much about it over the years and so on, and we have people in there now. And we've seen it, any Google search will tell you all manner of things relating to this facility, and even some of our clients complaining about it now. Why would we not have established a standard that deals with these types of facilities in addition to the normal standard that we have? I understand about the building codes and so on and so forth, but we don't actually have a standard as it applies to this process that we're now dealing with. Why not?
I think that they represented such a smaller part of our system in the past, and now certainly they are a much bigger part of the total number of shelter beds we have in play. About half are in motels and hotels now, and through you, Chair, it's a gap I think we've identified that we'd like to close.
All right, so if I move a motion to address that, obviously you've actually seen that motion. We've talked about this in the last day or so, and so that would hopefully help you to address this issue, which I would imagine that you would consider it as certainly it's an absence in terms of our overall strategy in terms of trying to housing people and so, but not yet having a criteria and or a standard for those facilities that we're spending millions of dollars to acquire as part of a temporary process. Will you agree that this is a bit of a fail on our part to this point?
Through you, Deputy Mayor and Chair, certainly, adding that to our array of standards will be of benefit for the system going forward.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tanner, for the answers. All right, members to speak. Looking at visiting members. All right, I see Councillor McKelvey to speak. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I just wanted to ask me to please move the recommendation that I put forward to you on my behalf. I think it's important that we look at what the new owner of the Lido is going to do to clean up this property, to find out what the security is going to be like on site and how we can make this better for everybody, for the residents in the building, for the neighbors. And so I just ask for your indulgence to please move that, and we can have a look at this again in March before they sign off on the contract. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor McKelvey. All right, and I will take carriage of that motion for you. Looking at the screen to see if anyone else wishing to speak. Seeing none. I do have a motion as it relates to the questions that I've been asking of Mr. Tanner, and thank Mr. Tanner for responding. I'm not sure if the clerk has the motion available. We can actually just put it on the screen. It's part of it's pretty long. I think it's at number 3 that's incorporated into the motions. We'll scroll down. Keep going to number 3. Yeah. So number 3 there really speaks to the need for us to have a standard and or criteria that we really look at when we look to acquire services from these types of facilities that seem to be available at the moment, which is hotels and motels. I have had some conversation with Mr. Tanner, and he is, through the questioning that I've asked him here today, he's certainly amenable. This is something that we really didn't have in place, and I think it really should be in place for us to have a standard that we require to the facilities that we are going to be spending considerable amounts of monies with. And even if we weren't spending considerable amounts of monies with them, but we're spending some monies. But the fact is we are putting people in these particular facilities and shelters and so on, and not all of them, but some of them do leave a lot to be desired, quite frankly. And I certainly would have great concerns in terms of putting people in facilities that I wouldn't put my dog in, quite frankly. And I don't have a dog, right? So I'm just simply saying that it is, quite frankly, it's inappropriate for us as a city to be looking at that particular type of facility and putting people in and not actually having a requirement for our own standards and so on. And I think we need to have standards. We're spending a lot of money in some of these facilities and all these facilities, quite frankly. And there are many that actually have no challenges and no issues whatsoever, such as, at least the one that we are actually approving here today. However, the one that we're not moving forward here today has a long history of problems and so on. And we're continuing that relationship. And I can only feel some degree of pain for those residents who are in need of the shelters and of course we're trying to ensure that people have facilities that that we can help them and get out of the inclement weather as part of a discussion we had earlier on and so on. And I know that staff's hands are tied. It's a tough situation there. Not a tremendous amount of supply stock in place, and they're trying to do the best they can, but that isn't good enough in essence in terms of some of these facilities, that at least this one particular facility here that we have, that is a problem in my view. And I think that we do have to have an external standard as well. We have strong standards for our own facilities, what we put in place, and that's terrific. But I think also we're missing that small portion where we need to have standards for those external facilities that we are actually going to put people in and so on. Mr. Tanner understands that in his team, and I'm putting forward that motion so that we can address this particular issue. So the items there, Councillor McKelvey.
I just have a question of the
you
mover.
have you don't have the authority to question me at this point. You're not a member of committee. So, but let me just do this. I'll waive if members are okay with it. I'll waive that, but you're not a member of committee, and that's not one of the features that you have. But I'll waive that, Councillor, because this is really important, and I know this facility is in your ward. So go ahead, please. Sorry, let's make sure. Sorry, just 1 second. Just make sure that others are okay. Members of committee, are you okay with me waiving that process to allow a councillor to be able to ask the questions? Because it's really important. Go ahead, please, Councillor McKelvey.
Just the wording, and I realize staff probably prepared that for you. The original wording that I submitted, it was prior to award of contract, and now I think it says report on the award of contract. So I'm just worried about that wording. I just wanted to clarify that in your item 2 there.
I don't actually have item 2. I think item 2 was yours. Oh, I see. On your behalf.
But it's not my wording.
Oh, I don't know whose word. So staff, maybe you'll just have the staff to comment on that, please.
Through the chair, I can help on that. We amended the motion so that the award can come with the report back on what they're going to do. So you can approve the award if the information is sufficient so that they can go execute the contract.
No.
So, Mr. Potolo, can I just ask a question? Did you discuss it with the councillor prior to making the changes?
Unfortunately, I did not. I was working with Julie just in the last, few minutes.
Okay, fair enough. So, councillor, this was your motion. Was that what your intent was?
I think you can just say prior to award of contract, and I'm happy. Like, I think the problem right now is, like it says,
just
your
prior
report on the award of contract, not prior to the award of contract.
Got you.
The intent I was trying to get is that we come forward asking for permission to award, which was missing in the original. But prior to award is fine, because I'm trying to say come forward and make the recommendations based on the new information that SHA will get from the new Lido.
Okay, so then maybe Thompson can just amend it to say prior to the award, so it's just crystal clear. You don't have authority to award this until we see it.
That's correct. That I am completely exactly what the intent was. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much to the committee for indulging. I know that was not normal protocol, but thank you.
That's fine.
Thank you.
But that was a good thing to make sure that we catch that and we're satisfied with respect to the the tenets of the motion and the amendment is appropriate. So the clerk has been listening to the conversation, so the word prior to the contract would be incorporated in that, and that would suffice for Councillor McKelvey, and it also works for Mr. Pochuluk as well. So it actually it meets the goals and objective, right? All right, so we'll just give the clerk a minute to make the necessary changes. And Councillor McKelvey, if you could take a look at that. I see the word prior is there. So are you satisfied with that? Fantastic. All right. So members, you've had an opportunity to review the amended change to the motion. All those in favor? I can't see all the hands. Okay, oppose? That's carried. Okay, thank you very much. All right. So we will go back now to the item that we were dealing with prior to EC 27.9, which is EC 27.8.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order, Vice Chair Grimes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was happy to move Councillor Ainsley's motion, but after Councillor Cressy moved on the fly to just have the work done, I talked to our Deputy City Manager. He would strongly recommend that the report come back, that we report back. So I will amend it to report back if that's appropriate.
Okay, and did you have your consultation with Councillor Ainsley? Is he okay with that?
No, I just got but I was happy to move Councillor Ainsley's report back. Councillor Cressy kind of moved on the fly to do it, but staff has some concerns. I said it strongly recommend that they should report back on that, not just have staff go do the work. So I think I just like that we report back.
Right. Just Councillor Ainsley, just
on a point of personal privilege, Councillor, can you retract your Councillor Cressy moving on the fly in that
Councillor Cressy, I apologize. I'm just saying it's kind of happened quick. So I was happy to move Councillor. I rescind that. I didn't mean any disrespect, Joe. It just kind of came at the end. So
I'll move the motion as put by the councillor.
Good. Okay. So thank you very much. All right. Madam Clerk, just before we move ahead, and thank you very much, Councillor.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Carol. Yes, Councillor Ainsley. Point of order. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so we're going back to my original motion?
That's my understanding, Councillor Ainsley. And I wanted the clerk just to comment on your original motion, and Councillor Carroll's going to take carriage of it for you. But I really wanted the clerk to make a comment because I think that there is a directional that this committee is giving, and I think council needs to give that direction. So I wanted the clerk maybe just to comment on your motion, and then we can deal with it thereafter. Madam Clerk, could you comment?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, just before we do that, because I'm just confused because Acting Fire Chief Jessup said he was okay with moving forward.
That may be so, Councillor Ainsley, but I want to make sure that we're actually within the confines and following the rules of council. The acting deputy chief may say, I can do it. However, I want to make sure that it's consistent with respect to council's rules. That's what I'd like to check.
Okay.
Thanks, Councillor Ainsley. Madam Clerk, would you comment, please, on Councillor Ainsley's motion? I think because it seems to me there's some budgetary concerns there, Councillor Ainsley, that is not consistent with respect to the cooling budget. So I think there's an augmentation of change there that may require the clerk to comment because of council's direction. So Madam Clerk, I wonder if you would comment, please, and just clarify that for us so we have a greater understanding of Councillor Ainsley's motion and its impact.
Sure, Mr. Chair. I also see that the Deputy City Manager, Tracy Cook, is on as well. We've just been in conversations with them and people from that division over email. So I'm not sure if you'd like her to comment on those budgetary implications, if she will have that context.
Sure, that would be fine. If members are okay, we will just vary the process and allow Ms. Cook, our Deputy City Manager, to speak to this issue. So we have clarity and clarification so that when we make the decision, it will be the appropriate decision based on the rules and the regulations that governs the way we conduct ourselves as a committee.
Right.
Ms. Cook, are you there?
I am, Deputy Mayor Thompson. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning. Sorry for all the confusion. I think the issue is simply it was unclear, and it looked like the direction was being given to expand this program into other climate-related issues. If that it was the intention or the case, there are definitely budgetary impacts as a result of that. manpower and resourcing issues as well we need to address. So given it was done it's been very quickly, we need that opportunity to look at what the ask is, what the impacts are, and if there will be resource and financial impacts as a result of it, then that needs to go through the appropriate process. Happy to work with the councillors between now and council if there's something else they'd like to see being done. But as far as expanding the program, there's work that we need to do in order to bring an informed conversation to committee and council. That's why the report back would be best. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So members, you've heard Ms. Cook. Again, is there any questions for Ms. Cook at this time? Because I think she has provided a tremendous amount of clarity in terms of what the impact is. Okay, I see none. Councillor Ains. Oh, so Councillor Carroll, sorry, I see now.
Yeah,
Councillor Carroll, go ahead, please.
I have not spoken on this item.
Yeah.
What I understand to be the case now is that I have moved the motion on behalf of Councillor Ainsley as originally put after the discussion. What I understand is that the vice chair is moving a different motion, that there be a report back to council, or that we refer it to staff. I'm not quite sure exactly what his motion is, but we are allowed to vote on both motions, and a councillor is allowed to move a motion with a financial impact. I would prefer to move the motion that they proceed as the original discussion sort of ended with before we went on to the other item. I'd like to move that motion for the councillor because we're on our way to approving a budget. And so if we're going to do this with all haste, staff should take it upon themselves to present on a yellow sheet or on a supplementary report what the financial impact would be. And if council doesn't like the action that we've taken, if my motion carries, then they can let us know at council.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll move
Councillor Grimes. Councillor Grimes.
I'll move the original motion that Councillor Ainsley that we report back. That's what my intention, to take care of Paul's motion, and then Joe Askell was friendly, and we saw Mr. Jessup ahead. But I think after talking to Deputy City Manager, I'll move that we take his original motion, report back to staff, go for a report to come back.
I'm sorry, I still don't I know what my motion is. I still don't understand what the vice chair's motion is.
So, Councillor Carroll,
okay,
report back to this committee or to council?
One at a time, please.
Councillor Carroll, I took care of Paul's motion.
Councillor Grimes, Councillor Grimes.
Yeah.
Councillor Grimes.
Yeah.
Please allow Councillor Carroll to speak, and then let's listen, and then you can speak thereafter, so we can understand clearly what needs to be done. Councillor Carroll.
I guess
just give me a moment, please.
What I'm asking right now is a question of the mover. Is
Councillor
your motion that
Councillor Carroll?
It's a question of the mover.
Councillor Carroll, give me one moment, please. I will actually have to ask.
Sorry, I seem to have frozen out. I've turned my video off.
Okay, no problem. Just give me one moment, please, because we now have to ask that this matter, because we're at the lunch break.
Sorry, I'm having a freezing problem. I've turned my video off. I hope you can hear me.
Move
Councillor Carroll, we can hear you. Can you hear us? No, we're going to do that, and that's what I want to get to. So we're going to ask that we vary.
Sorry, I turned my video off. That's all I can do. Can you hear me?
Councillor Carroll, we can hear you. Can you hear me? Councillor Carroll? I don't think Councillor Carroll can hear me. If somebody would just text her. Yes, go ahead.
To the chair, this is the host. I will attempt to reach out to Councillor Carroll directly.
I've turned my video off. It may be
Carroll.
necessary for the other speakers to
please.
turn their videos off in order for the WebEx to work.
Out to her. So what I would like to do is just to move to complete this item, because we're at the 12:30, almost 12:30. So all those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Okay, great. So Councillor Grimes, we can now come to you in order to.
I'm still getting a freezing motion, and it may be necessary for you, Mr. Chair, or for Councillor Grimes to turn off his mic. We need to remove some bandwidth usage here in order to get back to speaking. Oh, there we are. I'm sorry, whatever was being said there, I wasn't able to hear, but what I was trying to do was ask a question of the mover.
Sure. Can you hear us now, Councillor Carroll?
Yep.
Councillor Carroll, can you hear us?
So my question of the mover is, I'm still not clear. Is your motion to take the wording of Councillor Ainsley's requested motion and have staff report back to this committee?
Yes, Councillor Carroll, that was the original motion that Councillor Ainsley said I'd take care of it, and it was original was to report back. Councillor Cressy then just kind of said, you know, why don't we just have them do the work kind of at the last minute. So after talking to staff, I think I'll move the original motion that Councillor Ainsley that we report back to this committee, and that's strongly recommended by the Deputy City Manager Tracy Cook. So that's what I'll be moving. It's Paul's original motion that he asked me to take care of from the get-go.
Thank you.
Is that
so
clear?
what I will do, my different motion to clarify is that the wording that I choose to use is the friendly amended wording as proposed by my colleague Councillor Cressy. So you have two motions before you.
Yeah, and it's just on a, not to further complicate this, staff have confirmed that what we believe to be friendly is not, because it is, they do not have the budgetary power, because it involves a change in the scope beyond what we understood. And so, Councillor Carroll, I'm only flagging that because after further consultations with staff, they've advised that they don't see that as friendly. So I'm just flagging.
That's correct. So, all right, so we have two motions.
If I may just propose a point of order.
Yes, go ahead, please, Councillor Carroll.
The person who determines whether or not a motion is friendly is the mover. That's Robert's rules. Staff may have an opinion that a councillor shouldn't move a motion that incurs a cost, but the status of whether or not a motion is friendly is decided by the mover. When someone says, I'd like to amend it, if that's friendly, then the mover just has that wording added to their motion. That's what friendly amendment means.
Yes,
that's my point of order. If you could rule that I'm correct or incorrect, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Carroll. You are in fact very correct, but I actually thought that Councillor Ainsley thought that was a friendly motion. Did you not, Councillor Ainsley, thought it was friendly? That's what I thought.
Yes.
At the time, exactly. So we're all good. So if we want to have the two motions on the floor, which, as Councillor Carroll pointed out, she would like to move the motion, the original motion by Councillor Ainsley. Councillor Grimes is going to move the report back. We have two motions. We now just simply need to vote on them. We understand all of the mechanics and all the information associated as to why one motion is preferably versus the other motion. And let's be very clear. Staff are not actually giving us indication and or providing their input as part of the committee to say that it was not friendly. They may think that, but they're not giving this committee any direction. So I just want to make that very clear. It was understood earlier between the conversation between Councillor Ainsley and Councillor Cressy that it was friendly. We're now determining that it's not, it's otherwise. Staff have clarified that through their response and conversation with members. So now we have two motions. Madam Clerk, which of the two motions will we do first? Will we do Councillor Ainsley's first, as it was the original motion, or the report back by Councillor Grimes? So members, you have two choices. You have two motions to vote on. And I won't editorialize to tell you how I'm voting.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to clarify that there are three motions on this matter, as Councillor Cressy also had a motion originally.
I understand, but the ones in questions are the ones associated with the ones that Councillor Ainsley had moved, and then Councillor Grimes had taken carriage, but now Councillor Grimes is essentially amending to report back. Councillor Cressy's motion, I don't think there's any issues with that.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. So we should vote on Councillor Ainsley's motion first, which was moved by Councillor Grimes, followed then by Councillor Carroll. And then if you want to move ahead after with Councillor Cressy's, I also want to clarify that the friendly amendment that was brought forward by Councillor Cressy to Councillor Grimes's motion, that motion is beyond the authority of the Economic and Community Development Committee, and it therefore needs to go to City Council because it expands the program and as such requires City Council approval. So I just wanted to clarify that, Mr. Chair.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. All right. So which of the two motions are you putting up first?
So we will start first with Councillor Ainsley's motion, which was the original motion that was brought forward by Councillor Grimes.
Report back.
Okay. Can we put it on the screen, please, so that members can read it, so that they are aware as to what they're voting on. All right, members, you have Councillor Grimes' motion, which is a report back. So I'd like to ask for a recorded vote on that item, please. Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll just give me one quick minute.
I'll take your time.
So members, when I call your name, please unmute your mic, indicate your vote by stating in favor or opposed, and put your mic back on mute. Councillor Carroll?
Opposed.
Councillor Cressy?
In favor.
Councillor Ford?
In favor.
Councillor Grimes?
In favor.
Councillor Lai?
In favor.
Councillor Thompson?
In favor.
So, Mr. Chair, that carries with 5 members in favor and 1 member opposed.
And that makes my motion redundant.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So the next motion, Councillor Cressy's motion, please. So members, you have Councillor Cressy's motion. Did you want to record and vote on this one, or we just deal with it as it is? Okay. All right. All those in favor, oppose, that carries. Madam Clerk, I think that deals with that item. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Yes, it doesn't. We don't need clauses amended and so on. All right, Madam Clerk, according to my list of items, it appears that we have concluded and completed all the items on the agenda today. So that would require us now to have a motion to conclude the business of the day. Is that correct? We have exhausted the agenda?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
All right, just wanted to confer with you. All right, members, thank you very much for very robust discussions today and a great meeting. We are now at the point where I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Councillor Lai, your motion to adjourn carries. Thank you. Have a great day and a wonderful weekend to everybody. Stay safe, all the best. Thank you, bye-bye. And thank you to all the staff members. Have a great weekend, you all. Thanks, bye.